He was born into a world already on fire, a world in which the throne of England was disputed by two claimants whose hatred for one another had reduced the kingdom to something barely recognizable as a functioning civilization. And yet from that chaos, from those scorched and fractured foundations, he would build something that would outlast nearly every institution of his age. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Phone face down, volume at a whisper. Let's dive in. Henry, who would become the second king of England to bear that name and the first of the great Plantagenet line, entered the world in the 5th day of March in the year 1133, in the city of Le Mans, in the county of Maine, in a region whose loyalties and borders had been contested for longer than anyone then alive could easily remember. He was born to Geoffrey of Anjou, a count of formidable ambition and considerable military talent, a man whose family emblem, a sprig of the broom plant, the Plantagenista in Latin, would lend its name to the dynasty his son would found, and to Empress Matilda, the daughter of Henry I of England. A woman who carried within her the blood of the conqueror himself, a woman who had been crowned Empress of the Holy Roman Empire at the age of 12 and widowed at the age of 23, a woman who had spent the better part of her adult life fighting for a crown that English barons persistently refused to acknowledge as rightfully hers. The England into which Henry II was born, or rather the England he would one day inherit, was a kingdom submerged beneath what contemporaries would come to call the Anarchy. 19 years of civil war, of burned harvests and terrorized peasants, of castles built without royal license by barons who answered to no higher authority than their own appetite for land and power. The chronicler, known as the author of the Peterborough Chronicle, described those years in terms that still carry their horror across the centuries. They said openly that Christ and his saints slept. The roads were dangerous, the markets were empty. The great administrative machinery that Henry I had constructed, the itinerant justices, the sheriffs accountable to the crown, the exchequer with its twice-yearly audits, had seized and rusted into something nearly inert. Stephen of Blois, Matilda's cousin, sat on the English throne by virtue of having arrived in England first after Henry I's death in 1135, by virtue of having the support of the English barons, who preferred a pliant and generous king to a formidable and demanding empress. But Stephen's generosity was precisely the thing that was undoing him, because generosity to barons is another name for the surrender of royal authority. And by the time young Henry was old enough to understand what was happening in England, that authority had been distributed so widely among the magnates of the realm that it had ceased to exist in any meaningful sense at all. His childhood was not the childhood of a boy sheltered from these realities. He was educated first in Bristol, in the household of his great-uncle Robert of Gloucester, Matilda's most powerful supporter, a man of learning as well as arms, and then at Fontevraud, and later, under the extraordinary tutelage of Master Matthew in Bristol, and most significantly of all, in the household of the scholar and teacher William of Conches, who had already shaped the intellectual formation of some of the finest minds of the age. Henry was a student of genuine capacity. The chroniclers who knew him in later life remarked consistently on the breadth of his reading, on his ability to move between Latin and French with equal facility, on his interest in law and theology and history, on the range of his intellectual curiosity. He was not merely literate in the functional sense that many medieval kings managed. He was educated in the fullest sense of that word, a man who understood the institutions he would govern not only from above, as a monarch might, but from within, as a scholar does. He crossed to England for the first time as a combatant in 1147, when he was only 14 years old, bringing with him a small force of mercenaries whose wages he could not actually afford to pay. The expedition was a military embarrassment. The mercenaries eventually had to be paid off by Stephen himself, in one of those courtly absurdities that the anarchy produced in abundance, but it established something important about Henry's character, something that would define his entire reign. He acted. He did not wait for conditions to become favourable. He did not permit the imperfect to become the enemy of the possible. He arrived in England with insufficient forces and insufficient funds because the alternative was not to arrive at all, and not arriving was, in his understanding, simply not an option. He returned to the continent, resumed his education, and waited for the moment to ripen. That moment would come, but before it did, several things occurred in rapid succession that transformed Henry from the eldest son of the Empress Matilda into the most powerful territorial magnate in Western Europe. In the year 1150, his father Geoffrey invested him with the Duchy of Normandy, recognizing that the Norman barons would accept Henry's authority more readily than they would accept Geoffrey's own. In 1151, Henry performed homage to Louis VII of France for Normandy, formally acknowledging the feudal structure that bound him to the French crown, while simultaneously establishing himself as a duke capable of that diplomatic performance. And then, in the year 1152, came the event that would transform the political geography of the entire region. Eleanor of Aquitaine, having secured the annulment of her marriage to Louis VII on the grounds of consanguinity, married Henry of Anjou within 8 weeks of her divorce, bringing with her the Duchy of Aquitaine, one of the largest, wealthiest, and most culturally sophisticated territories in France. Henry was 19 years old. Eleanor was approximately 29 or 30. Their union was not arranged by others. It was arranged by themselves, with the speed and deliberateness of two people who understood exactly what they were acquiring from one another. Henry gained Aquitaine. Eleanor gained a husband who was, unlike Louis, a man of energy and purpose and political genius. Together they controlled territory from the borders of Scotland which Henry had not yet secured but would to the Pyrenees. The death of his father Geoffrey of Anjou in September of 1151 had already given Henry Anjou and Maine. The marriage to Eleanor gave him Aquitaine. The Duchy of Normandy was already his. What remained was England, and England was where the crown was, and the crown was what Henry had been born to claim. The question was not whether he would pursue it, but when and how, and the answer to that question was provided, with the kind of clarity that history occasionally produces, by the progressive collapse of Stephen's position in England during the early 1150s, a collapse driven partly by military pressure from Henry's supporters, and partly by the simple exhaustion that 19 years of civil war had produced in a kingdom that wanted, above almost everything else, to be governed again. Henry crossed to England in January of 1153 with a substantial force, and what followed was not quite a campaign in the conventional sense, because Stephen, although he continued to resist, was a man whose military situation was deteriorating, and whose health was failing, and whose eldest son Eustace, the person on whom all hope of perpetuating the Blois dynasty rested, died suddenly in August of 1153 from causes that contemporaries attributed to divine displeasure and that modern analysis suggests may have been a seizure, perhaps epileptic in origin. The death of Eustace removed the principal obstacle to a negotiated settlement, and negotiations proceeded with remarkable speed once it was removed. The result was the Treaty of Winchester, also known as the Treaty of Wallingford, confirmed in November of 1153, by the terms of which Stephen acknowledged Henry as his adopted son and heir. Henry acknowledged Stephen's right to reign for the remainder of his life, and the magnates of England swore to uphold this arrangement and to accept Henry's kingship upon Stephen's death. Stephen died on the 25th of October in 1154 at Dover of what appears to have been a stomach ailment, perhaps a gastric ulcer, perhaps something more acute, and Henry, who was in Normandy when the news reached him, crossed to England in December of 1154, landing at a date variously recorded as the 7th or 8th of December, and was crowned at Westminster Abbey on the 19th of December, alongside Eleanor, who was crowned Queen of England on that same day. He was 21 years old, she was approximately 31 or 32, and the kingdom they inherited was in a condition that any honest observer would have described as dire. The barons had built unlicensed castles throughout the Anarchy. The chroniclers speak of over 1,000 of them, though this figure is certainly an exaggeration, the true number being perhaps in the hundreds, and these castles were not merely architectural facts, they were political ones, each one a node of local power that operated independently of royal authority, each one requiring its own supply of military personnel and its own revenue base, each one representing a direct challenge to the notion that the king was the supreme source of justice and order within his realm. The forests had been encroached upon, the royal demesne had been alienated in exchange for support during the Civil War, the sheriffs had become, in many cases, local strongmen who collected revenue in the king's name, but remitted only what they chose to remit to the royal treasury, keeping the rest for themselves and their retinues. The Exchequer, that magnificent instrument of fiscal administration that Henry I had developed, had not met in any systematic way for years. The legal system was fragmented, inconsistent, and available primarily to those with the wealth and power to exploit its inconsistencies. Henry moved against all of these problems simultaneously, with a speed and comprehensiveness that astonished even those who had observed his earlier career closely. The unlicensed castles were ordered demolished. Not all of them were actually demolished immediately. The politics of that were more complex than a royal decree could resolve, but the principle was established, the expectation was set, and the process of demolition proceeded over the following years with sufficient determination to make clear that the king intended to be taken seriously. The barons who had received royal lands or revenues during the Anarchy were required to return them. The sheriffs were subjected to a great inquiry, what would come to be called a visitation or inquest, in which their financial accounts were scrutinized and the discrepancies between what they had collected and what they had remitted were addressed with a vigor that those sheriffs had certainly not anticipated. The Exchequer resumed its regular meetings, its pipe rolls resumed their meticulous recording of royal finances, and the fiscal machinery of English royal government ground back to life with a thoroughness that had not been seen since the final years of Henry I's reign. It is worth pausing here to understand what Henry was doing, because it is sometimes described as restoration, the restoration of good governance, the restoration of the order that had prevailed under his grandfather, and there is truth in that description, but it is insufficient. Henry was not merely restoring, he was building. He took the instruments his grandfather had invented, and he refined them, extended them, applied them to situations and domains that Henry I had not reached or had not troubled to reach, and in doing so, he created something genuinely new, a system of royal administration so sophisticated, so ramified, so deeply embedded in the local structures of English life, that it would persist and develop for centuries after his death, forming the foundation upon which the common law of England, and by extension, the legal traditions of every nation that inherited the English legal tradition would be constructed. The restoration of royal authority over the barons and the sheriffs was the necessary precondition for everything else Henry intended to accomplish, but it was not, in itself, the most consequential of his achievements. That distinction belongs to his legal reforms, to the systematic transformation of the courts of England and the procedures by which justice was administered, a transformation so fundamental that historians of English law speak of Henry II with the kind of reverence usually reserved for founding figures, for the architects of new systems, rather than the inheritors of old ones. When Henry came to the throne in 1154, justice in England was, as it had been throughout the medieval period, a fragmented and inconsistent thing. There were royal courts, presided over by the king or his justices, handling certain categories of dispute matters touching the crown's interests directly. Matters concerning the great magnates who held their lands directly of the king. There were baronial courts, in which the lord of a manor judged disputes involving his own tenants, according to local custom that might vary significantly from one estate to the next. There were ecclesiastical courts, administered by the church, claiming jurisdiction over an enormous range of matters, not only the obvious things, like heresy and marriage and the probate of wills, but also contracts sworn on oath, the behaviour of clergy, and a host of other issues that touch the boundary between the sacred and the secular. And there were the ancient local courts, the shire court and the 100 court, presided over by the sheriff and the local magnates, operating according to custom that was often immemorial in its antiquity and correspondingly resistant to standardization. Into this complexity, Henry introduced a series of legal instruments that, taken together, amounted to a revolution. The most important of these were the writs, standardized written documents issued from the royal chancery, each one initiating a specific type of legal action in a specific type of royal court, each one available for purchase by anyone who could afford the modest fee. And that modest fee was the point, because it meant that the royal courts were accessible not only to the great magnates, but to the ordinary free tenants of England, the men who held land by knight service or by sergeanty or by socage, and who, before Henry's reforms, had been entirely at the mercy of their lords' private courts for the resolution of their disputes. The writ of novel disseisin new dispossession gave a tenant who had been recently and forcibly removed from his land a swift remedy in the royal courts. A jury of 12 local men would be assembled to answer a simple factual question: whether the plaintiff had been unjustly disseized of his free tenement, and if the jury found in his favour, he would be restored to possession immediately, without the lengthy and complex process that had previously been required. The writ of mort d'ancestor, death of ancestor, allowed the heir of a recently deceased tenant to establish his right to inherit the land against any competing claimant, again by means of a jury answering straightforward factual questions. The Grand Assize offered a defendant in a land dispute the option of having his case determined not by trial by battle, that ancient and brutal procedure in which the question of right was resolved by combat, but by a jury of 12 knights who would examine the merits of both claims and return a verdict based on their knowledge and investigation. These innovations were not accidents of administrative convenience. They were the product of careful legal thinking, of a mind, whether Henry's own mind or the collective mind of the royal council and the legal scholars who advised him, that had grasped a fundamental truth about the relationship between law and political power, that a king who makes himself the source of justice, who makes his courts more accessible, more reliable, and more consistent than any alternative available to his subjects, acquires thereby a power over those subjects that no army could replicate and no castle could secure. Every man who brought his land dispute to a royal court rather than to his lord's court was, by that act, acknowledging the king's superior authority. Every verdict rendered by a royal jury was a lesson in the proposition that the king's law was the highest law in England. The constitutions of Clarendon, issued in January of 1164, represented Henry's attempt to extend this principle into the domain of ecclesiastical jurisdiction, to assert the royal claim to authority over the clergy in a range of matters that the Church had been treating as exclusively its own. The constitutions were a written statement of what Henry described as the ancient customs of the realm, the practices that had prevailed under Henry I, and that had, in his view, been eroded during the Anarchy. Clergymen accused of crimes should be tried first in the royal courts, with the church courts handling only the question of clerical status. Appeals to Rome should be made only with the king's permission. Disputes over the patronage of churches, the question of who had the right to appoint a priest to a living, should be determined in the royal courts rather than the ecclesiastical ones. The holders of great church offices should receive their temporalities, the lands and revenues associated with those offices, from the king, and should perform homage to the king for them, acknowledging thereby that they held from him as well as from God. The church resisted, and the man who led the resistance was a man who had, until very recently, been Henry's closest friend, his most trusted minister, his chancellor, and his confidant, Thomas Becket, who had been appointed Archbishop of Canterbury in 1162, and who had, upon his appointment, undergone a transformation so complete that those who had known him before found themselves bewildered, confronting a man who seemed to have replaced every characteristic they had admired with its religious counterpart. Thomas Becket was born in the year 1118 or 1119, the son of a Norman merchant settled in London, a man of comfortable but not aristocratic origins who had risen through the church's administrative structures to become Archdeacon of Canterbury and then, through the patronage of Archbishop Theobald, to be introduced to the young King Henry in the early years of his reign. Henry recognised in Becket something that was, in one who knew how to look for it, unmistakable. administrative genius, combined with personal charisma and a capacity for loyalty that, once engaged, was absolute. He made Becket his chancellor in 1155, and for 7 years the two men worked together with an intimacy that was remarkable even by the standards of medieval royal government, where the relationship between a king and his chief minister was often one of the most intense and consequential of either man's life. As chancellor, Becket was magnificent. He administered the royal finances with scrupulous efficiency. He led military campaigns in Toulouse and in Normandy with genuine ability. He maintained a household of extraordinary magnificence, entertaining foreign visitors and English magnates alike with a lavishness that reflected, and was intended to reflect, the wealth and sophistication of the English crown. He was Henry's ambassador, his agent, his representative in a dozen diplomatic negotiations, his companion in hunting and in the more informal pleasures of court life. The chroniclers describe a friendship of unusual warmth, two men who could disagree with one another and then laugh about the disagreement, who shared jokes and confidences and the ordinary pleasures of companionship. There is a famous story, perhaps apocryphal, but revealing in its very apocryphal quality, of Henry and Becket riding through the streets of London on a winter day and encountering an old man in a thin cloak, and Henry suggesting that the man should be given a warm cloak, and Becket agreeing, and Henry then seizing Becket's own magnificent fur-lined cloak and giving it to the old man, while both of them laughed uproariously at the joke. Whether or not this story is literally true, it captures something essential about the relationship, the ease, the intimacy, the mutual trust. And then, in 1162, Archbishop Theobald died, and Henry decided that the See of Canterbury, the most powerful ecclesiastical office in England, should be filled by his chancellor, his friend, the man he trusted, above all others, to manage the complicated intersection of royal and ecclesiastical power that had become the central political problem of his reign. Becket himself warned Henry against the appointment, reportedly saying something to the effect that Henry would hate him if he became archbishop, that the obligations of the office would put them at cross purposes in ways that Henry did not yet imagine. Henry proceeded anyway, confident in his understanding of his friend's character. He was wrong, with a magnitude and a consequences that would define the rest of his reign, and indeed the manner in which posterity would remember him. Thomas Becket, upon his consecration as Archbishop of Canterbury in June of 1162, became, with a thoroughness that seems, even at this distance of centuries, almost theatrical in its completeness, a different man. He resigned the chancellorship immediately over Henry's objection. He adopted the austerities of a devout religious life, wearing a hair shirt beneath his archbishop's vestments, practicing fasting and prayer, washing the feet of beggars, performing the devotional exercises of a man wholly given over to the life of the Spirit. And he became, in his official capacity, an implacable defender of clerical privilege, refusing to concede to the crown any of the jurisdictional territory that the Church had occupied during the years of the Anarchy, insisting on the independence of ecclesiastical courts, refusing to allow any restriction on appeals to Rome, opposing the constitutions of Clarendon with a firmness that Henry found first surprising, then infuriating, and finally intolerable. The Council of Northampton in October of 1164 was the moment when the conflict passed from argument into something approaching open war. Henry summoned Becket before the Royal Council and pursued him with charges of contempt and financial irregularities from his time as Chancellor, charges that were in many respects pretextual, but that served to create a legal situation in which Becket could be convicted and sentenced by the secular authority Henry controlled. Becket refused to submit. He appeared before the council carrying his own archiepiscopal cross, a piece of symbolism so pointed that several of the bishops present begged him to put it down before it provoked Henry beyond recovery. He appealed to Rome. He left England in secret the following month, crossing to France in disguise, and spent the next 6 years in exile on the continent, under the protection of King Louis VII of France, who, with the particular satisfaction of a man whose former wife had so conspicuously traded up, was happy to support any difficulty that Henry encountered. The exile lasted from 1164 to 1170. During those 6 years, the conflict between Henry and Becket played out across a vast diplomatic canvas involving the papacy of Alexander III, who was himself in a difficult position, being contested by an imperial anti-pope and therefore in need of Henry's support, which gave him reasons to moderate rather than escalate the dispute. The French court, which had its own reasons to complicate Henry's affairs, and the network of papal legates who moved between England, France and Rome, attempting to broker a settlement that neither principal genuinely wanted. There were negotiations at Montmirail in January of 1169 and at Montmartre in November of 1169, each of which produced agreements that seemed, for a moment, to offer resolution, and each of which collapsed when Becket added qualifications, the phrase salvo honore Dei, saving the honor of God, appended to his expressions of submission that Henry found unacceptable because they preserved, beneath the surface of reconciliation, Becket's right to appeal to a higher authority than the king. The reconciliation that finally occurred at Freteval in July of 1170 was, like its predecessors, imperfect. The fundamental issues were not resolved. The question of clerical criminality, the question of appeals to Rome, the question of the constitutions of Clarendon, all of these remained where they had been when the dispute began, unresolved and potentially explosive. What changed at Freteval was not the substance of the disagreement, but the political situation surrounding it. Henry needed Becket's cooperation for the coronation of his eldest son, young Henry, which was scheduled to occur in the summer of 1170 and which required, in the normal course of ecclesiastical protocol, the participation of the Archbishop of Canterbury. Becket returned to England in December of 1170, landing at Sandwich, where he was greeted by enormous crowds of common people who had, throughout his exile, venerated him as a champion of the Church against royal overreach. A reading of the conflict that was not entirely without foundation, but that simplified considerably the complexity of what had actually been at stake. His return was not peaceful. He moved immediately to excommunicate the bishops who had participated in the coronation of young Henry in his absence, a deliberate act of ecclesiastical power that infuriated the king and the bishops alike. Word reached Henry, who was in Normandy for the Christmas season, of Becket's actions and of the general turbulence of the situation in England. And Henry responded with words whose exact form has been debated by historians ever since, but whose effect was catastrophic. The most famous version, recorded by the chronicler Edward Grimm, has Henry saying something equivalent to, "What miserable drones and traitors have I nourished and promoted in my household, who let their lord be treated with such shameful contempt by a low-born cleric?" The precise words are less important than the effect. 4 knights of the royal household, Reginald Fitzurse, Hugh de Morville, William de Tracy, and Richard le Breton, interpreted what they heard as a royal command, crossed to England, and on the 29th of December, in 1170, in Canterbury Cathedral, murdered Thomas Becket before the altar of St. Benedict. The murder horrified Christendom. The shock was not merely moral, although it was that the violation of sanctuary, the killing of an archbishop, the shedding of blood in a sacred space, these were offences of a gravity that the medieval Christian imagination could barely accommodate. The shock was also political, because the murder transformed Becket immediately and irrevocably from a troublesome prelate whose positions had been, in many respects, defensible only with significant theological nuance, into a martyr, a saint, the most famous saint of the English Church, the subject of miracles reported from the very night of his death, and multiplying with extraordinary speed throughout the following months. Pope Alexander III canonized him in February of 1173. Barely 3 years after his death, a process that normally took decades had been compressed to a matter of months by the force of popular devotion and the political embarrassment of allowing the matter to remain unresolved. Henry performed public penance at Canterbury in July of 1174, walking the last mile barefoot, submitting to a scourging by the monks of the cathedral priory, spending a night prostrate at Becket's tomb. The penance was genuine in its physical discomfort, and it was also politically essential. The moral damage done to Henry's reputation by the murder required a response of sufficient visibility and humility to begin the process of rehabilitation. and the penance accomplished that, though the rehabilitation was never complete, because Becket's story was too powerful, too morally simple in its available reading, the righteous archbishop against the tyrannical king, to yield to the complexities that a more thorough understanding of the dispute would require. Yet, it is essential to resist the gravitational pull of that simple reading, because what it obscures is as important as what it reveals. Henry's position in the dispute over clerical criminality was not without rational foundation. The privilege of clergy, the protection of ordained men from secular courts, was a genuine problem for royal governance, because it meant that a man who committed murder or robbery or any other serious crime could escape the king's justice simply by virtue of having taken holy orders, and could receive, in the ecclesiastical courts, a penalty that secular opinion widely regarded as insufficient. The case of Philip de Broye, a canon of Bedford, who was accused of murder and whose case in 1163 was handled by the ecclesiastical courts in a way that Henry considered a scandal, was precisely the kind of example that gave force to his position. The Church's claim to total immunity from secular jurisdiction was not, in the abstract, an obviously correct position. It was a position that served the institutional interests of the clergy and that had significant costs for the maintenance of public order. What Henry failed to understand, or what he understood but allowed his anger to override, was that the question of whether his position was rationally defensible was ultimately less important than the question of whether the time and the political circumstances were right for pressing it, and they were not. Becket, whatever his personal motivations, and the question of how much was principle and how much was personal pride and wounded friendship has occupied historians for centuries, was fighting on terrain that gave him enormous advantages, because the language of ecclesiastical independence and the protection of the Church from secular encroachment was language that resonated deeply throughout Western Christendom, language that popes and councils and theologians had been developing for more than a century as part of the great reforming movement that had transformed the medieval Church. And Henry, for all his legal acumen and political intelligence, was arguing against that tide. The Becket affair damaged Henry's reputation in ways that were permanent and profound, but it did not stop him. It interrupted him, it complicated him, it required the expenditure of diplomatic and political capital that might otherwise have been deployed elsewhere. But the administrative revolution he had set in motion continued and deepened, and produced during the decade following Becket's murder some of the most significant institutional innovations of the entire reign. The Assize of Clarendon, issued in 1166, was in many respects the most consequential legal reform of Henry's reign, more consequential even than the writs of Novel Disseisin and Mort d'Ancestor, because it addressed not merely the private disputes of free tenants but the public problem of criminal justice, the systematic prosecution of those who preyed upon the peace and order of the realm. The Assize established a procedure of presentment jury in every county and in every 100 of England. 12 men of the 104 men of each township were to be sworn to present before the king's justices the names of anyone in their community who was accused or suspected of robbery, murder, or theft, or of harbouring those who committed such crimes. Those presented were to be subjected to the ordeal of water, a form of trial by which innocence was demonstrated by sinking and guilt by floating, and if convicted were to be hanged, even if they passed the ordeal. If their reputation in the community was sufficiently bad, they were to be banished from the realm. The Assize of Northampton, issued in 1176, extended and strengthened the Clarendon provisions, adding to the list of crimes subject to presentment the offences of forgery and arson, increasing the penalties for those convicted, and establishing a more regular system of judicial visitations, the Eyre, a circuit of royal justices who travelled through the counties of England on a regular basis, carrying with them the authority of the Crown and the instruments of the royal legal system, hearing the presentments of the juries, determining the pleas of the Crown, auditing the accounts of the sheriffs, and generally extending the reach of royal administration into corners of English life that had previously been governed, if governed at all, by local custom and local power. The Eyre was one of Henry's most powerful instruments of royal government. A general heir, a comprehensive visitation touching all the pleas of the crown and all the administrative business of the counties was a formidable thing. Descending upon a county with the authority to inquire into everything, to call any official to account, to hear any complaint, to collect any revenue owed to the crown. It was also, from the perspective of the local population, an expensive thing, because the fines and amercements imposed by the royal justices were a significant source of royal revenue, and because the process of the heir itself created costs in travel, in accommodation, in the assembly of jurors and witnesses that fell partly on the county as a whole. The men of England had a saying, recorded by later chroniclers, that they dreaded the coming of the justices in heir like the coming of a thunderstorm, which tells us something important both about the power of the institution and about the ambivalence with which Henry's subjects regarded the extension of royal justice into their lives. The assize of arms of 1181 represented a different dimension of Henry's administrative program, the systematic organization of military obligation throughout the realm. The assize required that every free man hold weapons appropriate to his wealth and status. A knight was to maintain a coat of mail, a helmet, a shield, and a lance. A man with less than the wealth of a knight, but more than 16 marks, was to have a coat of mail, a cap of iron, and a lance. A man with 10 marks was to have an iron cap and a lance. The poorest freemen were to have lances or other weapons as they could afford. The intention was to create a national pool of military capacity that could be called upon in time of need, that was not dependent on the feudal obligations of the great magnates with all their complexity and negotiability, but rooted instead in the property-holding free population of the realm as a whole. This was not an entirely new idea. The Anglo-Saxon fyrd had been organized on something like this principle, but Henry's assize systematized it, extended it, and connected it to the administrative machinery of the exchequer and the heir in ways that made it practically effective in a new way. The young king's rebellion of 1173 and 1174, of which more will be said, temporarily interrupted the pace of reform, but it did not reverse it. And in the years that followed the suppression of the rebellion, Henry returned to the work of institutional construction with a renewed intensity, as if the experience of the rebellion had confirmed his view that the consolidation of royal authority was not merely administratively desirable but existentially necessary. The Great Inquest of the Sheriffs in 1170 was a comprehensive investigation of official corruption, producing a wholesale replacement of the sheriffs who had been in office, men who had, in many cases, built up networks of local power and local interest that compromised their accountability to the crown, with men more directly dependent on royal favour and more susceptible to royal oversight. The results of this inquest are visible in the pipe rolls of the following years, which record the accounts of the new sheriffs with an unusually precise attention to the discrepancies between what they collected and what they remitted. It is in these pipe rolls, those magnificent, infuriating documents, rolled and stitched into great cylinders and stored in the exchequer year by year, that the full reach and ambition of Henry's administrative programme becomes most visible to the historian, who is willing to sit with them long, enough to understand what they record. Every sheriff in England accounted twice yearly for the revenues of his county, listing what he had collected in royal rents and judicial amercements and forest fines and the dozens of other categories of royal income, listing what he had spent in the king's name on the maintenance of royal castles and the salaries of royal servants, and calculating the balance owed to the crown. The pipe rolls of Henry's reign fill volume after volume in their modern printed editions, and they reveal a monarchy whose financial administration was, by the standards of any contemporary government in Western Europe, extraordinarily sophisticated. The question of Henry's relationship with the territories he governed across the Channel is inseparable from any understanding of his reign, because England, for all its importance, for all the intensity of his administrative activity there, was only one part of an assemblage of territories that contemporaries and modern historians alike have called the Angevin Empire, a term Henry himself would never have used, since empire was a word loaded with specific constitutional meaning in the 12th century, but a term that captures something real about the scale and coherence of what he ruled. At the height of his power, Henry's authority extended from the borders of Scotland. He had secured the return of Northumberland and Cumberland and Westmoreland from Malcolm IV of Scotland in 1157, and had received the homage of William the Lion for Scotland itself, though the nature and implications of that homage remained contested, south through England to the Channel, across to Normandy, south through Maine and Anjou to the Loire, east to the borders of Burgundy and Champagne, south again through Poitou and Touraine to Bordeaux, and then, by virtue of Eleanor's Aquitaine, all the way to the foothills of the Pyrenees. He was, additionally, the overlord of Brittany, which he had acquired by arranging the betrothal of his son Geoffrey to the heiress Constance of Brittany in 1166, and which came fully under his control following the military campaign of 1170. He was the nominal overlord of Ireland following the invasion of 1169 and 1170, of which considerably more will be said, and he maintained a complicated and evolving relationship of influence and dependency with the Welsh princes, who acknowledged his superiority without surrendering their practical independence. To govern this assemblage of territories, and the word govern must be used carefully, because the nature of 12th century governance was not the governance of a modern administrative state, but something more personal, more itinerant, more dependent on the physical presence of the king himself and on the networks of loyalty and obligation that the king's presence continuously renewed and reinforced. Henry travelled with a restlessness that astonished contemporaries, and that has left behind it a remarkable documentary record. The court moved constantly. One chronicler estimated that the king's household travelled so fast and so far that it seemed to those observing it less like a royal court than like a flight. Bishops and barons who wished to petition the king had to chase him across the countryside. The phrase ubi rex ibi curia, where the king is, there is the court, was not merely a constitutional formula, but a practical description of how government actually worked. Following the king, wherever the king happened to be at the moment when a decision needed to be made. This itinerant quality of Angevin royal government was not a weakness, but a deliberate political strategy. A king who stayed in one place was a king whose visibility and authority were confined to that place. A king who moved constantly across his territories was a king who was continuously demonstrating his presence, his power, his accessibility to those who sought justice or favour, and the seriousness of his intention to be the sovereign of everything he claimed to rule. The practical difficulty, of course, was enormous. Moving a royal household in the 12th century was an exercise in logistics almost beyond modern imagination. The carts and pack animals carrying the royal furniture and documents and treasury, the horses for the knights and clerks and servants, the provisions for the hundreds of people who made up the court's permanent establishment, the advance riders who went ahead to arrange accommodation, the messengers who carried documents between the king wherever he happened to be, and the various administrative centres, the Exchequer in London, the ducal administration in Rouen, the seneschals and viscounts in Anjou and Aquitaine that kept the territories functioning in his absence. The problem of governing in absentia, of maintaining effective authority over territories, the king was not physically present in drove some of Henry's most important institutional innovations. He developed the office of justiciar in England, a great official who served as the king's representative when the king was out of the country, presiding over the royal court and the exchequer, handling the routine business of royal government and the exceptional crises that arose without waiting for the king to return from Normandy or Anjou. Richard de Lucy held this office for much of Henry's reign, and his reliability and competence were indispensable to the king's ability to govern England from across the Channel without the kingdom falling into the disorder that had characterized the absences of earlier kings. Later, Ranulph de Glanville would hold the same office, and it is to Glanville, or at least to the legal thinking associated with him, that we owe the treatise on the laws and customs of England, known as Glanville, the first systematic account of the English common law, a text whose very existence is a testament to the degree to which, by the later years of Henry's reign, the legal system he had constructed had become sufficiently coherent and institutionalized to be susceptible to systematic description. The administration of the continental territories was, necessarily, different in character from the administration of England, because those territories had their own traditions, their own legal customs, their own administrative structures that predated Henry's rule, and those traditions were not easily or desirably replaced. Normandy had its own exchequer, modelled on the English one, which audited the accounts of the Norman sheriffs in much the same way that the English exchequer audited its equivalents. Anjou had its own administrative traditions, shaped by the energetic governance of the Angevin counts who had preceded Henry's father. Aquitaine was the most resistant to centralisation of all, a vast and diverse territory of perhaps 40 counties, speaking Occitan rather than French or Latin, organised around the customs of a culture that had its own strong sense of identity, its own literary and musical tradition, its own understanding of what lordship and justice and governance meant. Ireland entered Henry's political calculations in a way that was almost accidental, or at least that bears the character of an opportunistic intervention rather than a long-planned campaign, though the opportunism, once indulged, produced consequences that were permanent, complex, and historically enormous. The background lies in the political fragmentation of Ireland in the middle of the 12th century, a fragmentation that was structural and deeply rooted. Ireland was divided into a number of kingdoms whose rulers competed among themselves for the high kingship, a position of symbolic supremacy that conferred prestige but not necessarily effective sovereignty, and whose competition produced the kind of shifting alliances and periodic warfare that made the island, from an outside perspective, look ungovernable. The key figure is Diarmait mac Murchada, the King of Leinster, who in 1166 was expelled from his kingdom as the result of a political defeat at the hands of his rivals, most notably Ruaidhrí Ua Conchobar, the High King, and Tigernán Ua Ruarc, a local lord whose wife Diarmait had abducted in 1152, a grievance that Tigernán had nursed for 14 years before finding the opportunity to act on it. Diarmait, expelled from Leinster and in need of military assistance, did what a dispossessed medieval lord with European connections might naturally do. He sought help from the most powerful king available to him. He came to Henry's court in Aquitaine in 1166 and received from Henry a letter authorising any of his subjects who wished to assist Diarmait to do so, with the implicit royal blessing that such a letter conferred. This letter was the crucial document. It opened the door to the participation of the Anglo-Norman lords of Wales, men like Richard de Clare, the Earl of Pembroke, known as Strongbow, who had extensive lands but uncertain prospects in England, and who saw in Diarmait's invitation an opportunity for land and power in Ireland that their situations in England could not offer them. Strongbow crossed to Ireland in 1170 with a substantial force, captured Waterford and Dublin, married Diarmait's daughter Aoife as part of the agreement by which he had been recruited, and established himself as a power of first importance in Irish affairs. When Diarmait died in 1171, Strongbow claimed Leinster in right of his wife, a claim that produced immediate complications for Henry, because a great magnate holding an independent kingdom was precisely the kind of thing that Henry's entire governance philosophy was designed to prevent. Henry responded by invading Ireland himself, landing on the 2nd of October in 1171 with a force substantial enough to make resistance by the Anglo-Norman settlers, including Strongbow, inadvisable. Strongbow submitted immediately, receiving Leinster back from Henry as a fief, acknowledging thereby that he held from the king rather than in his own right. The Irish kings, faced with a military force whose quality exceeded what they had previously encountered, offered submission in large numbers. The kings of Leinster, Meath, Munster, Bryfna, and Uriel, among others, came to Henry's court at Cashel or at Dublin and acknowledged his overlordship. Only the kings of the northern part of the island, Connaught and Ulster, held back, and even they recognised that they were dealing with something new and formidable. Henry remained in Ireland for the winter of 1171 and 1172, long enough to establish the basic framework of an English administration, to grant the city of Dublin to the men of Bristol with its own borough charter, to receive the submission of the Irish bishops at the Synod of Cashel, where the Irish Church aligned itself with Rome and with the organizational structure of the continental church in ways that Henry's presence clearly facilitated, and then to return to England when news arrived of the crisis in his relations with the papacy following Becket's murder. A crisis that required his presence and his penitential submission. The Ireland he left behind was not, in any meaningful sense, pacified or governed in the way that England was governed. The Anglo-Norman settlers were a presence primarily in Leinster and around the coastal cities. The Irish kings, having submitted to Henry, continued to rule in their own territories according to their own customs. Regarding their submission as a pragmatic acknowledgement of military reality rather than a fundamental change in the nature of their sovereignty, the process of Irish Anglo-Norman interaction that Henry had initiated would continue for centuries, producing a society of extraordinary complexity and persistent conflict that would defy every attempt at simple resolution. But the Act of 1171, the crossing, the submissions, the grants, established the English claim to Ireland that would persist, in one form or another, for 800 years. Scotland presented a different kind of problem. William the Lion, who had become King of Scotland in 1165, following the death of his brother Malcolm IV, was an ambitious man who had not reconciled himself to the return of the northern English counties that his brother had been obliged to accept in 1157. He saw in Henry's difficulties the Becket affair, the rebellion of 1173, the general turbulence of the middle years of Henry's reign opportunities to press Scottish claims to Northumberland, and in 1173 he joined the great rebellion against Henry that his sons had organised, invading northern England with a Scottish army while Henry was preoccupied on the continent. William's timing was unfortunate, in a way that seems, in retrospect, almost comic. In July of 1174, while Henry was at Canterbury performing his penance at Becket's tomb, a group of Yorkshire knights captured the Scottish king, who had been separated from his main force during a raid near Alnwick, and brought him south in chains. The capture of William the Lion transformed the political situation in the north at a stroke. By the Treaty of Falaise, concluded in December of 1174, William became Henry's vassal, not for Scotland in general, as the nature of his earlier submission had been ambiguous, but specifically and unambiguously for Scotland itself, doing homage for the kingdom, accepting the subordination of the Scottish Church to the English Church at York, and providing hostages for his compliance. The treaty was a comprehensive humiliation of Scottish independence, though its terms would be reversed after Henry's death by Richard I, who needed Scottish goodwill and was willing to sell it. The Great Rebellion of 1173 and 1174, the most dangerous internal crisis of Henry's reign, the moment when the edifice of Angevin power came closest to collapse, had its origins in the complicated and ultimately tragic situation of Henry's sons, and in the contradictions inherent in Henry's way of governing an assemblage of territories that demanded, by their very nature and by the expectations of the lords who held within them, a distribution of power that Henry found, by his own nature and by the logic of his governance philosophy, impossible to concede. Henry had 4 surviving legitimate sons. He would eventually have 5, with the birth of John in 1167, but John was too young to participate in the rebellion and the problem of what to do with them, how to provide them with the dignity and the resources that their status demanded while preserving the unity of authority that his administrative system required, was one that Henry never successfully resolved. Young Henry, the eldest, had been crowned King of England during his father's lifetime, a procedure without precedent in English history that Henry had insisted upon as a mechanism for securing the succession and preventing the kind of disputed inheritance that had produced the Anarchy. Young Henry was crowned in June of 1170, the coronation from which Becket was pointedly excluded, and bore from that moment the title of king, the expectation that attaches to kingship, and the conspicuous lack of any actual power, revenue, or territory to govern. Richard was given Aquitaine as his inheritance, a duchy he would govern from his early teens, with a combination of military ferocity and administrative energy that marked him, even in his youth, as a figure of exceptional capacity. Geoffrey was betrothed to Constance of Brittany and would eventually govern that duchy, which was, Of the 4 major inheritances Henry distributed among his sons, the most coherently defined and the most practically governable. John, the youngest, was called Lackland Jean Sans Terre because, when the distribution of inheritances was arranged, there was nothing left for him, a situation that Henry later attempted to address by securing for him the lordship of Ireland and by planning a marriage alliance with the heiress of Savoy that would have given him a territorial base in the Alps, a plan that came to nothing. Young Henry, as he was always known to distinguish him from his father, was 22 years old in 1173, a magnificent young man, by all accounts physically beautiful, generous, skilled in tournament, beloved by the knights of his household in the way that a lord who spent lavishly and asked little was always beloved, and he was growing increasingly desperate under the humiliation of being a king in name without being a king in fact. His father refused to give him real power. His father refused to give him adequate revenue. His father controlled the appointments to every significant position in England and Normandy, tolerated no independent action from his crowned son, and showed no sign of intending to change any of this arrangement in the foreseeable future. The resentment had been building for years. The spark came in the form of a proposal from Henry that his youngest son, John, then 6 years old, should receive the castles of Chinon, Loudun, and Mirabeau from young Henry's inheritance. Young Henry refused, and when Henry pressed the matter, young Henry fled the Norman court in secret in March of 1173 and made his way to the court of Louis VII of France, who welcomed him with an enthusiasm that reflected the French king's delight at the opportunity to cause maximum difficulty for his Angevin neighbour. Richard and Geoffrey followed their brother, and Eleanor attempted to join them, disguising herself as a man for the journey, a detail that the chroniclers record with evident fascination, but was captured by Henry's forces before she reached the French border and imprisoned, a captivity that would last for the remainder of Henry's reign, 16 years in all. The rebellion that followed was, by the standards of the age, formidable. The King of Scotland invaded from the north, the Count of Flanders crossed the Channel with an army, Louis VII of France attacked from the east. In England, the Earls of Leicester, Chester, Norfolk, Derby, and Huntingdon rose against the king, and the rebel Earl of Leicester landed in England with a Flemish army in the autumn of 1173. Henry found himself simultaneously defending his position in England, Normandy, and Brittany against a coalition that included his 3 eldest sons, the kings of France and Scotland, and some of the most powerful magnates in England and Normandy. It was, on paper, a coalition that should have overwhelmed him. It did not. Henry's response to the rebellion revealed something essential about the nature of his power, which was not merely military, but administrative. The institutions he had built over 2 decades of governance, the loyal sheriffs, the itinerant justices, the fiscal machinery of the Exchequer, continued to function, continued to collect revenue, continued to organize resistance, even when the king himself was racing between theatres of conflict with a speed that his contemporaries found almost supernatural. The rebel Earl of Leicester was defeated at the Battle of Fornham in November of 1173 by a royal force largely composed of Flemish mercenaries hired with Exchequer funds. Henry crossed to England in the summer of 1174, performed his penance at Canterbury, received the news of William the Lion's capture the following morning in what contemporaries could only interpret as divine endorsement of his penitential act, and then moved with devastating speed against the remaining rebel strongholds in England, reducing them one by one with a combination of military pressure and the willingness of men who saw which way the wind was blowing to abandon a cause that was clearly failing. By the autumn of 1174, the Great Rebellion was over. Henry had suppressed it with a thoroughness that was, given the scale of the opposition he had faced, remarkable. His sons submitted. Louis VII accepted a negotiated peace. William the Lion was in English custody, awaiting the terms that would become the Treaty of Falaise. The rebel earls in England were pardoned. Henry's mercy toward the defeated was, with some notable exceptions, genuine and politically intelligent, based on the understanding that the destruction of great magnates creates instability rather than resolving it, but their castles were, in many cases, demolished, and the peace that followed was a peace in which the royal administrative system, rather than baronial power, was the dominant fact of English political life. Young Henry's submission was accepted, but the underlying problems were not resolved, because they could not be resolved within the constraints of Henry's understanding of how power should be organized. Young Henry continued to receive an income. Henry doubled it after the rebellion to £2,000 a year, but he continued to have no real authority, no castles of his own, no genuine role in the governance of the territories over which he was nominally king. He continued to spend lavishly on his household of knights, on tournaments in which he participated with the enthusiasm of a man for whom tournament was not mere sport, but the central business of his life and the primary source of his sense of worth. And he continued to be unable to afford what he spent, and to be dependent on his father for additional payments, and to be humiliated by that dependence. The tournament world that young Henry inhabited was not marginal to the history of the age. It was central to the culture of aristocratic self-understanding in the 12th century. The tournament, the mock battle in which teams of knights fought for ransoms and for honour, was the primary arena in which the military virtues that defined noble status were demonstrated, tested, and rewarded. Young Henry was among the finest tournament knights of his age, celebrated throughout the chivalric world of northern France and England, and the household he maintained, including, at one point, the famous knight William Marshal, who would become one of the defining figures of the subsequent generation, was a magnificent one by any contemporary standard. But magnificence required money, and money required his father's generosity, and his father's generosity was conditional on a submission that young Henry found humiliating. The second rebellion of the younger generation came in 1183, and it was, from the beginning, different in character from the rebellion of 1173, smaller in its international dimensions, but more bitter in its personal ones, driven specifically by a dispute between young Henry and Richard over the governance of Aquitaine. Young Henry had been attempting to establish himself in Aquitaine, raiding the duchy and supporting the Aquitanian barons, who resented Richard's vigorous and frequently brutal governance of their territory. Henry Sr. attempted to mediate, proposing various arrangements that young Henry should go on crusade, that Richard should give up Aquitaine to John, that the territories should be redistributed in ways that gave each son something real to govern, and none of these proposals came to anything, partly because Richard refused to surrender Aquitaine, and partly because young Henry was, by 1183, a man whose political situation had become desperate enough that no partial solution could satisfy him. Young Henry died in June of 1183, at Martel, in the Dordogne, of a fever that appears to have been dysentery, aged 28. His death was recorded by contemporaries with genuine grief. He was mourned by the tournament world he had adorned, and by the common people who had loved his generosity, and it transformed Henry's political situation in Pau, ways that were not immediately apparent, but would prove, in the longer run, decisive. With young Henry gone, Richard was now the heir to England and Normandy, as well as Aquitaine, a position of overwhelming territorial superiority that made the problem of providing for Geoffrey and John more acute. Henry's attempts to manage this situation, to have Richard give up Aquitaine to John, to arrange new territorial settlements, met with Richard's implacable resistance, and that resistance would, over the following years, drive Richard into an alliance with the King of France that would eventually destroy Henry. Geoffrey, the third son, died in August of 1186 at a tournament in Paris, killed by the fall of a horse. He was only 28 years old, and his death simplified the succession picture while deepening the dynastic grief that Henry was accumulating with a terrible rapidity. He was buried at Notre Dame in Paris, and King Philip II of France, who had succeeded his father Louis VII in 1180, was said to have had to be physically restrained from throwing himself into the grave, a display of grief that tells us something about the extraordinary emotional intensity of the relationships that formed around the Angevin court, where princes and their supporters formed bonds of friendship and dependency that contemporaries experienced as among the most powerful and significant of their lives. Philip Augustus, as he would come to be known, the epithet, acknowledging his greatness in the tradition of Augustus Caesar, was a different kind of adversary than Louis VII had been. Where Louis had been pious, gentle, indecisive, and limited in his strategic vision, Philip was cold, calculating, patient, and possessed of a long-term strategy for the expansion of French royal power that he pursued with remarkable consistency over a reign that would last for more than 40 years. He had understood, from the earliest years of his reign, that the Angevin assemblage of territories was both the principal obstacle to French expansion and, potentially, its principal resource. If the contradictions within it, the rivalries between Henry and his sons, the resentments of the Aquitanian barons, the contested nature of Henry's authority in every territory he governed, could be exploited with sufficient skill. The alliance between Richard and Philip Augustus, which formed in the late 1180s and which would prove fatal to Henry, was not merely a political arrangement of the conventional kind, the alignment of two powers against a common rival. It was something more intimate and more complicated than that, a relationship shaped by the dynamics of Richard's position as a son who had been denied the inheritance he believed rightfully his, and whose trust in his father had been systematically and progressively destroyed over the course of the preceding decade. Richard was, by 1187 or 1188, a man who believed with evidence to support the belief that his father intended to disinherit him in favour of John, the youngest son, who had always been Henry's favourite in a way that was both emotionally genuine and politically consequential. The evidence for Henry's favouritism toward John was substantial. He had invested enormous diplomatic capital in securing for John the lordship of Ireland, visiting Ireland himself to establish the administrative framework, arranging John's marriage to Isabella of Gloucester to provide him with an English territorial base, and repeatedly proposing territorial arrangements on the continent that would have given John significant land holdings at Richard's expense. The proposal, renewed multiple times, that Richard should surrender Aquitaine to John was the most explosive of these, because Aquitaine was not merely a piece of territory to Richard, it was his domain, the place where he had spent his formative years governing and fighting and building the military reputation that was, by the late 1180s, the most celebrated in Western Europe. To be asked to give it up to a younger brother who had not earned it was, to Richard, an insult of a fundamental kind, an assault on his identity as well as his inheritance. Henry's relationship with his sons was, at its deepest level, a failure of imagination, not of political imagination, in which he was extraordinarily gifted, but of emotional imagination, of the capacity to understand how others experienced the consequences of his decisions. He could design institutions of remarkable sophistication. He could comprehend the strategic implications of legal reforms that would not produce their full effects for generations. He could manage the competing claims of a dozen territorial traditions with a dexterity that astonished his contemporaries. But he could not, or would not, understand that his sons were not merely extensions of his political will, to be positioned and repositioned according to the needs of his governance, but men with their own needs, their own pride, their own understanding of what dignity required and what humiliation meant. The Third Crusade negotiations provided the immediate context for the final collision. Saladin's capture of Jerusalem in October of 1187, a catastrophe that produced a wave of crusading fervour throughout Western Christendom, created enormous pressure on the kings of France and England take the cross to lead a new expedition to the east that might recover what had been lost. Henry and Philip met at Gisors in January of 1188 and agreed to take the cross together, imposing the Saladin tithe, a tax of 1/10 on all income and movable property to finance the expedition. But the agreement about the crusade did not resolve the underlying tension between the two kings, and the Saladin tithe itself produced considerable resentment in England, where it was collected with the full force of the royal administrative machinery. Richard's grievances had reached the point, by 1188, where he was willing to make common cause with Philip against his own father. In November of 1188, at a conference at Bonsmoulins, Richard publicly demanded that Henry acknowledge him as heir to England and all his continental territories, and that Henry agree to his immediate betrothal to Philip's sister Alice, a betrothal that had been arranged years before but never consummated. Alice, having lived for years at the English court in a situation whose ambiguity the chroniclers handled with considerable delicacy, suggesting that Henry had made her his mistress, a charge that Richard used as a reason why he could not possibly marry her, and that Philip found useful as a grievance against Henry. At Bonsmoulin, when Henry refused to make the acknowledgement Richard demanded, Richard knelt before Philip and did homage to him, the son of the King of England, performing homage to the King of France for the English continental territories in a gesture of deliberate, devastating political symbolism. The military campaign that followed in the spring and summer of 1189 was brief and disastrous for Henry. He was ill. It has been suggested that he suffered from a fistula, a deeply painful abscess that had been developing for some time, and the combination of physical suffering and the progressive deterioration of his military situation produced in him something that no observer of his earlier career would have recognized: passivity, indecision, a failure of the driving energy that had characterized every moment of his active life. Philip and Richard advanced into Maine. They captured the city of Le Mans on the 12th of June in 1189, and Henry's birthplace, the city in which his father was buried, a place of particular emotional significance, and Henry fled north toward Normandy, pausing on a hilltop to look back at the city burning below him and to say, in words recorded by the chronicler Roger of Hoveden, that God had taken from him the thing he loved most in the world, and that he would take from God the thing God loved most in him, which was his soul, by never again doing anything for God's honor. The words are almost certainly not verbatim. They may be entirely invented by the chronicler, but they capture, in their blend of despair and defiance, something real about the emotional state of a man who had built more than almost any other king of his century and who was watching it crumble. The end came at Chinon in July of 1189, in a manner that combined the political and the personal in ways that left Henry, by all accounts, a broken man in the days before his death. He had been brought to Chinon ill and exhausted, the peace negotiations with Philip proceeding without his having the physical strength to participate in them effectively. The terms agreed at Colombières on the 4th of July were humiliating. Henry would acknowledge Philip as his overlord for all his continental territories, would pay a large indemnity, would surrender various castles, and would agree to Richard's right to Anjou and all the continental possessions in addition to England. He accepted these terms, lying on a litter, too ill to stand. The final blow, the one that contemporaries and subsequent generations have found most dramatically resonant, came when Henry received the list of those who had joined Philip and Richard's coalition, the men who had abandoned him at the end. The list was read to him, and somewhere near its top was the name of John, his youngest son, his favourite, the one for whose sake he had, or so Richard believed, been willing to compromise Richard's inheritance, the child who was too young to have fought in the rebellion of 1173 and who had been, of all his sons, the one Henry had most consistently tried to provide for. John had joined the rebellion. Henry turned his face to the wall. He said, according to one account, that it was now permissible for everything else to go as it would, since he who was the shame of his family had also deserted him. Henry II died on the 6th of July in 1189 at Chinon, aged 56. His body was taken to the Abbey of Fontevraud, the great royal necropolis of the Angevin dynasty, where it was received by the nuns and prepared for burial. Richard, coming to Fontevraud shortly after his father's death, stood at the bier. This is one of the most famous scenes in the history of the Plantagenet dynasty, rendered and re-rendered in chronicles and in the historical imagination of every subsequent generation, and stood there for some time in silence. A trickle of blood appeared from the dead man's nostril, which contemporaries interpreted as a sign of the corpse's awareness of the presence of the person who had, effectively, killed him. Whether the story is true, it is what people remembered and what they repeated, and that act of remembering and repeating tells us what they understood about the relationship between the two men and about the manner of Henry's ending. The immediate condition of the realm Henry left behind was, paradoxically, better than the circumstances of his death might suggest. The institutions he had built were intact. The exchequer functioned. The heir continued. The pipe rolls would continue to be enrolled year by year. The legal procedures he had innovated, the writs, the juries, the possessory assizes had become embedded in the practice of English courts to the degree that they would persist regardless of who sat on the throne. The common law of England was not yet fully formed. It would not be for generations, but its foundations were laid, and those foundations were Henry's work. The territories, it is true, were in a condition of military and political disruption, from which recovery would take time and diplomatic effort. The Peace of Colombières had acknowledged the loss of significant positions to the French crown. Richard's first act as king would be to negotiate a more favourable peace with Philip, aided, as has been noted, by Philip's enthusiasm for the crusade which he needed Richard to join, and to set about recovering what had been lost. But the recovery was possible precisely because the institutional framework of Angevin governance was sufficiently robust to survive the turbulence of the succession, which is itself a testament to the quality of what Henry had built. His queen, Eleanor, had spent the last 16 years of his reign imprisoned, confined in comfortable but restricted captivity at various locations in England, Salisbury, Winchester, Berkhamsted, Ludgershall, prevented from exercising the political role that she had played, with remarkable energy and effectiveness, in the earlier years of the marriage. The imprisonment had begun following her capture during the rebellion of 1173, and it reflected both Henry's anger at her role in organising that rebellion. She had been instrumental in recruiting support for her sons among the Aquitanian barons who resented Henry's governance of their duchy, and his recognition that a free Eleanor was a political actor of the first importance, capable of doing considerable damage to his interests if she chose to. She had chosen to, in 1173, and the 16 years of captivity were Henry's answer to that choice. One of Richard's first acts upon his father's death was to send William Marshal, the great knight who had been among young Henry's household knights, before transferring his service to the old king to release Eleanor from custody. She emerged from captivity at the age of perhaps 67, with the energy, the political intelligence, and the will to govern that had characterized her from the beginning, and she would spend the remaining years of her long life, she would survive, until 1204, outliving not only Henry, but also Richard, deploying all of those qualities in the service of her sons and of the dynasty she had done as much as any single person to create and sustain. The Wales of Henry's reign deserves its own sustained consideration, because the Welsh situation illuminates in a particularly clear way both the reach of Henry's ambition and the limits of what even the most powerful ruler of his era could achieve when confronted by a population that was willing to fight indefinitely for its independence. Wales in the 12th century was not a unified kingdom. It was a collection of principalities, each with its own ruling dynasty, its own internal politics, its own complicated relationship with the Anglo-Norman lords, who had been settling the border regions since the conquest. But it was possessed of a cultural and linguistic identity that was distinct and fiercely defended, and of a geography that made it almost uniquely resistant to the kind of systematic conquest and administrative integration that Henry had accomplished in England. The Welsh princes had been present at the court of Henry's grandfather, Henry I, as clients and subordinates, and the relationship Henry II inherited was one in which Welsh rulers acknowledged English superiority in theory, while resisting its practical implications with remarkable persistence. Henry conducted 3 major military campaigns into Wales, in 1157, in 1163, and the most ambitious of all, the Great Campaign of 1165, which ended in a humiliation that was all the more striking for the scale of the preparations that had preceded it. In 1165, Henry assembled an enormous army, the largest he had brought into Wales, and advanced into Snowdonia, the heartland of Gwynedd, and the stronghold of Owain Gwynedd, the most powerful Welsh prince of his generation. The Welsh response was not to meet him in battle, but to melt before him into the mountains, destroying the roads and the bridges as they retreated, cutting off the supply lines that the English army depended upon, turning the Welsh terrain itself into the instrument of resistance. Henry was forced to retreat, abandoning the campaign without having achieved any of his objectives. The humiliation of 1165 prompted a response that, in retrospect, appears to represent a genuine moment of loss of control. Henry ordered the blinding and castration of 22 Welsh hostages he was holding, the sons of Welsh nobles, whom their fathers had given as guarantors of peace. The hostages were mutilated, and the mutilations were public, a deliberate act of calculated cruelty intended to demonstrate that resistance had consequences. It succeeded in demonstrating nothing except that Henry, when sufficiently frustrated, was capable of acts of barbarism that contradicted the image of a ruler governed by law and justice that his administrative program projected, and it did not, in any meaningful sense, change the military or political situation in Wales. The Irish situation, the establishment of English lordship over Ireland, and the Welsh situation, the failure to establish meaningful English control over Wales, are, taken together, a useful corrective to any too simple picture of Henry as an administrator of irresistible efficiency. He was formidably capable, but he was not omnipotent, and the territories that resisted him most effectively were those where the combination of difficult terrain, committed local leadership, and a population with strong cultural identity made the kind of administrative integration he had accomplished in England impossible to replicate. Wales would not be meaningfully incorporated into the English crown until the Statute of Wales in 1284 under his grandson, Edward I. Ireland would resist effective English governance for centuries. Scotland would achieve independence, confirmed by the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton in 1328, within a century and a half of Henry's death. The financial dimensions of Henry's reign are inseparable from its institutional dimensions, because the fiscal system and the legal system were, in his governance, deeply intertwined. The courts were, among other things, revenue-generating mechanisms, and the revenue generated by the courts funded the itinerant justices and the mercenary soldiers who made the courts effective. The pipe rolls of Henry's reign show royal revenues growing substantially over the course of the reign, from the levels of the early years when the administrative machinery was being rebuilt, to the more substantial sums of the later years when the machinery was fully operational. The exact figures are difficult to establish with precision because the pipe rolls record what was accounted for at the Exchequer rather than what was actually collected, and the relationship between these two things was not always straightforward, but the trend is clear. Henry was a considerably wealthier king at the end of his reign than he had been at the beginning. This wealth was not accumulated for its own sake. Henry was not avaricious in the manner of some medieval kings, accumulating treasure as an end in itself, but it was essential to his governance, because military operations required money, administrative institutions required money, diplomacy required money, and the maintenance of a court of sufficient magnificence to project the image of royal power required money. The Saladin tithe of 1188, which was intended to finance the crusade, produced an amount variously estimated at £60,000 to £70,000, an extraordinary sum, larger than the annual revenue of the English crown in a normal year, and the administrative machinery that collected it with such efficiency was itself a product of the institutional development of the previous 30 years. The culture of Henry's court was not the most brilliant in Europe. That distinction, in the 12th century, belonged perhaps to the court of his wife in Poitiers during the years when she was effectively governing Aquitaine in the later 1160s. But it was a court of genuine intellectual vitality, and the men who passed through it, or who were formed by its institutional culture, included some of the most significant figures of the age. John of Salisbury, one of the great political philosophers of the medieval period, whose Polycraticus is among the most sophisticated analyses of the nature of political authority produced in the 12th century, was closely connected to the court, having been associated with Becket at Canterbury. Walter Map, whose De Nugis Curialium on the Trifles of Courtiers is one of the more entertaining and illuminating accounts of Angevin court culture, was a royal clerk who served Henry for years and who left behind in his writing a vivid if sardonic portrait of court life. Peter of Blois, another royal clerk and prolific letter writer, served Henry and left behind an extensive correspondence that tells us a great deal about how the court functioned and how those within it experienced it. The relationship between Henry's governance and the development of English literature and learning is more indirect than the equivalent relationship in Aquitaine, where Eleanor's patronage of the troubadour tradition was central to the development of vernacular poetry in ways that shaped the literary culture of the entire following century. But Henry presided over a court in which literacy was assumed, in which Latin learning was valued, in which the clerks of the royal chancery who produced the torrents of writs and charters and letters that the administrative system required were educated men, in the full sense of that term, capable of theological argument and philosophical reflection, as well as the production of legal documents. The training of these clerks, the demand for their services, and the career opportunities that royal service provided created, over the course of Henry's reign, a significant expansion of the learned culture of England that should not be overlooked in any account of his legacy. The question of Henry's personal religiosity is complicated. He was capable, as the penance at Canterbury demonstrated, of genuine acts of religious submission. He was also capable, as the events of the 29th of December in 1170 demonstrated, of passionate anger that overrode whatever religious restraints his training and his piety might otherwise have imposed. The chroniclers who were well disposed toward him describe a man who attended Mass regularly, who was generous to religious houses, who took the obligations of Christian kingship seriously in his understanding of what they required. The chroniclers who were hostile, and the most influential of these, the writers who had Becket's perspective as their frame of reference, were very hostile, describe a tyrant whose religiosity was superficial and performative, a cover for a will to power that brooked no opposition, whether from barons, bishops, or archbishops. The truth was more complicated than either picture and more interesting. Henry was a man of the 12th century, and the 12th century was a century of religious transformation, of the deepening and systematization of religious thought and practice, of the great reforming movements that had remade the institutional church and that were in the process of remaking the spiritual expectations that lay people applied to themselves. He was educated enough to understand the theological dimensions of the disputes he entered into, sophisticated enough to recognize that the question of clerical jurisdiction was not merely a matter of administrative convenience, but touched deep questions about the nature of authority and its sources. And he was politically intelligent enough to understand that the church was not merely an institution to be managed, but a force of extraordinary moral and cultural power, whose cooperation was essential to effective governance. Becket affair was, in the end, a failure of politics as much as a failure of personal relationship. Henry had a legitimate case. The governance of England required that the privilege of clergy be subjected to some royal oversight, but he pressed it at the wrong moment, against the wrong opponent, with insufficient sensitivity to the way in which the argument would be received in the broader context of European political culture. Becket had a legitimate case. The independence of the Church from secular coercion was a principle of enormous importance to the spiritual health of Christendom, but he pursued it with a rigidity that reflected, in part, a personal pride that was not easily distinguished from principled commitment, and with a tactical confidence in his own position as a martyr in waiting that was not available to him before the fact, and that could only be secured by an act whose consequences neither he nor Henry had fully anticipated. The murder of Becket was not the most consequential thing Henry did during his reign, but it was the thing for which he was most remembered, and the relationship between what he did and how he was remembered is itself a historical fact of considerable importance. It tells us about the moral priorities of the age, about the categories within which medieval people evaluated the actions of their rulers, about the particular power of the martyr narrative in a culture saturated with the stories of saints and their deaths. A king who had built the most sophisticated legal and administrative system in Western Europe, who had extended royal justice to hundreds of thousands of his subjects, who had transformed the relationship between the crown and the law in ways that would endure for centuries, was remembered primarily, in the decade and century after his death, as the man who had caused the murder of an archbishop. The institutional achievements were taken for granted, absorbed into the structures of governance so thoroughly that they became invisible. The dramatic event persisted, vivid and morally clear, in a way that institutional development could never be. The forest law of Henry's reign deserves attention not only as an administrative reality, but as a window into the particular character of royal power in the medieval period, and into the specific ways in which that power was experienced by those who lived within it. The royal forests of England, and they were extensive, covering perhaps a third of the land area of England at their greatest extent, were not forests in the modern sense, not simply woodlands, but legally defined areas within which the king's hunting rights were protected by a draconian system of regulation that extended to the deer, to the rabbits, to the trees, to the undergrowth, to the people who lived within the forest boundaries, and whose activities were constrained by the forest law in ways that the ordinary common law did not impose on those who lived outside them. Henry had inherited the forest law from his predecessors. The Conqueror and his sons had developed it, and the Anarchy had not abolished it, merely disrupted its administration, and he applied it with a rigour that contemporaries found harsh. The forest courts, presided over by the royal forest judges, imposed substantial fines on those who transgressed the forest law, whether by killing deer, by asserting clearing forest land for agriculture, or by a dozen other offences that were defined with sufficient breadth to capture a wide range of activities that the forest's residents might consider ordinary and innocent. The revenue generated by forest fines was significant, and the pipe rolls record it year by year with the same meticulous attention that they devoted to other categories of royal income. But the forest law was not only a revenue mechanism, it was also, and perhaps primarily, an assertion of royal sovereignty over a particular and important domain, an insistence that there were spaces within England where the king's will, his pleasure, his love of the hunt, which was, for Henry, not mere recreation, but one of the most important activities of his adult life, took precedence over the ordinary economic needs and activities of the population. It was, in this sense, the most personal expression of royal power that Henry's governance produced, a system designed not to advance the interests of his subjects, not to provide justice, not to extend the reach of royal administration into new domains, but to protect the king's own pleasure. Henry's hunting was legendary among his contemporaries. He spent extraordinary amounts of time in the field, pursuing deer and boar and other game with an energy that seemed disproportionate even to contemporaries who understood the importance of hunting in aristocratic culture. Peter of Blois, in a famous letter written in the voice of a courtier complaining about the difficulties of royal service, describes the chaotic unpredictability of the court's movements, driven largely by the king's hunting schedule, rising before dawn, riding vast distances in a day, arriving at destinations hours later or earlier than expected, eating irregularly, standing for interminable periods while the king conducted business or hunted. The complaint is satirical and exaggerated for comic effect, but it captures a real feature of Henry's court. The hunting was not subordinated to the governance. The governance was fitted around the hunting, and those who served the king had to accommodate both. The personal qualities of Henry II have been described, analysed, argued about, and mythologized since the first contemporary accounts were written, and the challenge of separating the historical person from the accretion of interpretation and legend that has gathered around him over 8.5 centuries is considerable. The physical descriptions that survive: he was of medium height, stocky in build, with reddish hair that he wore short, and a face described as leonine, with grey eyes that could blaze with anger or soften into charm, with large, powerful hands and a restless energy that manifested in constant movement, pacing, fidgeting, standing when others sat, are consistent enough across independent accounts to be credible, though they are also, inevitably, shaped by the conventions of medieval royal portraiture, which had its own expectations and its own narrative requirements. His intelligence was, by all accounts, of an unusual order. He had an extraordinary memory, the ability to recall the faces and names of those he had met years before, to retrieve specific details of legal cases or financial accounts, to track the implications of decisions across time and across territories, combined with a quickness of mind that made him a formidable interlocutor in debate and an intimidating presence in council. He could shift from apparently casual conversation to the precise examination of a complex legal or administrative question with a speed that disconcerted those who had not encountered it before, and he maintained, throughout his reign, a direct personal engagement with the detail of governance that was unusual in a king of his breadth of responsibility. His anger was also famous, the Plantagenet temper, which his descendants would inherit in various forms, was in Henry its most volcanic expression, the rage that filled the room, that drove men from his presence, that produced, in the case of Becket, the words that sent 4 knights across the Channel. But the anger, like most human characteristics, was more complex than its most dramatic manifestations suggest. It was often calculated, deployed as a political instrument to produce effects that cooler methods could not achieve. It was also, at times, genuinely uncontrolled, a surrender to impulse that Henry afterwards regretted and attempted to repair. The distinction between the two is not always easy to make in the historical record, and may not have been easy to make in the experience of those who witnessed it. The relationship between Henry and Eleanor, the most famous royal marriage of the 12th century and one of the most analysed partnerships in medieval history, was from its beginning a union of extraordinary mutual advantage that contained, embedded within the logic of its advantage, the seeds of its destruction. They married in May of 1152, within 8 weeks of Eleanor's divorce from Louis VII, with a speed that indicated clearly enough that both parties had been planning the match before the divorce was formalized. Henry needed Aquitaine. Eleanor needed a husband with the energy and political capacity to govern her duchy and to protect it from the encroachments of Louis, who would certainly attempt to reassert his authority over it once he recovered from the shock of the divorce. In Henry, she found a man of extraordinary capacity. In Eleanor, he found a territorial addition that made him the most powerful lord in France, and a woman whose intelligence and political acumen matched his own. The early years of the marriage were, by the evidence available to us, genuinely productive in every sense. They were together frequently. Eleanor accompanied Henry on campaign, participated in his governance, bore him a remarkable number of children, 8 surviving legitimate children, over a period of approximately 13 years, a reproductive record that reflects both the frequency of their physical proximity and the biological reality of a marriage between 2 healthy adults in their 20s and early 30s. She was an active queen, attesting royal charters, administering English governance during Henry's absences, presiding over courts in both England and Aquitaine. The picture that emerges from the documentary record of the first decade of the marriage is of a genuine partnership, unequal in formal terms. Henry was the king and the ultimate authority, but real in its mutual engagement. When the marriage began to deteriorate, is difficult to establish with precision. The chroniclers who describe the later breakdown retrospectively into the earlier period produce accounts that are compromised by that retrospection, seeing in the early years the signs of a conflict that only became fully visible later. What can be established is that by the mid-1160s, Eleanor was spending much of her time in Aquitaine rather than in England or Normandy, governing her duchy with a degree of independence that suggests a distancing from Henry's court. The court at Poitiers that she maintained in the period between approximately 1168 and 1173, the court at which Bernard de Ventadorn and other troubadour poets were active, at which the cultural ideals of courtly love were most fully elaborated, was, in its ambience and its values, something very different from Henry's court, and the difference was not accidental. The question of whether Henry was unfaithful to Eleanor is one that the chroniclers address with varying degrees of specificity and reliability. The relationship with Rosamund Clifford, the fair Rosamund of legend, is attested in sources that range from relatively contemporary to much later and more embellished. And while there is enough evidence to suggest that a relationship of some kind existed, the elaborate romantic narratives that surrounded it in subsequent tradition, the labyrinth at Woodstock, the Bower, Eleanor's supposed murder of Rosamund, are inventions of a later age's appetite for romantic drama. Other relationships are mentioned in various sources, some more credible than others. What is clear is that Henry's court was not characterized by the kind of marital fidelity that Eleanor, who had grown up in a culture that idealized, however paradoxically, a particular kind of courtly devotion, may have expected or desired. Eleanor's role in the rebellion of 1173, the specific question of how actively she participated in organizing her sons' revolt against their father, is one of the most contested questions in the historiography of Henry's reign. The chroniclers, most of whom were writing within a cultural framework that was suspicious of women in positions of political power and that had well-developed narrative conventions for describing women who exceeded the limits of appropriate female behavior, describe her role in terms that range from active conspirator to passive sympathizer. What is not in doubt is that Henry believed she had played a significant role, that her capture and imprisonment followed from that belief, and that the imprisonment, 16 years, in carefully controlled captivity, was Henry's response to what he regarded as the ultimate act of betrayal, the turning of his own sons against him. The irony, and it is an irony that the history is thick with, is that the sons Henry was so determined to keep under his control, so reluctant to allow genuine power, so insistent on managing and overriding and repositioning according to his own calculations of political advantage, were the instruments of his downfall. He built, over 35 years, an administrative system of extraordinary sophistication and durability, capable of surviving his death and providing the institutional foundation for the development of English governance for centuries. But he could not build a system for his family. He could not design a mechanism for succession that preserved both the unity of authority he valued and the dignity that his sons required. And in the end, it was not the barons, it was not the church, it was not the King of France who defeated him. It was his own children. The question of Henry's failures and a balanced assessment requires as serious an engagement with the failures as with the achievements, begins with his sons and extends from there. The inability to resolve the succession in a way that gave his heirs real authority and real responsibility before his death is the most consequential failure, but it is not the only one. His Welsh campaigns, as noted, achieved less than his confidence and his resources might have suggested was possible. His Irish intervention, though initially successful, left behind an unresolved situation whose complexity would compound over generations. The Becket affair, whatever Henry's legitimate grievances, was a failure of political judgment that damaged his reputation in ways from which it never fully recovered. The legal legacy of Henry II, of all his achievements, the one that has attracted the most sustained and sophisticated historical attention, and with good reason, because it is the one that most directly shaped the world that came after him, not only in England but in every country that inherited the English legal tradition. The common law of England, that system of judge-made law, developed case by case through the decisions of royal courts, applicable to all free subjects of the crown, expressed in the writs and the plea rolls and the reports that accumulated over centuries, has its origin as a coherent system in the legal reforms of Henry II. The key word is coherent. There had been royal courts before Henry. There had been royal writs before Henry. There had been juries of various kinds in various contexts before Henry. What Henry created, or more precisely, what Henry's reign initiated, since the full development of the common law was a process that continued for generations after his death, was a system, a set of interlocking procedures and principles that applied consistently throughout England, that were accessible through the purchase of standardized writs from the royal chancery, that were administered by a corps of professional royal justices who travelled the country on a regular circuit, and that produced, by their regular operation, a body of precedent of decisions in specific cases that shaped the way future cases would be decided, that accumulated over time into something approaching a jurisprudence. The Glanville Treatise, written sometime in the 1180s and associated with Ranulph de Glanville, Henry's great justiciar, is the first systematic account of this developing system, and its very existence testifies to the degree of coherence the system had achieved by the later years of Henry's reign. It describes, in organized form, the writs available to litigants, the procedures that followed from each writ, the defences available to defendants, the forms of trial appropriate to different classes of dispute. It is not a complete account. The common law was still developing, still working out its implications, still encountering situations that its existing categories did not adequately address, but it is recognizably a description of a legal system, and that fact alone is a measure of how far Henry's institutional program had advanced in the 35 years of his reign. The jury, which was Henry's most important procedural innovation, deserves particular attention because its significance extends far beyond the specific legal context in which Henry introduced it. The jury in its various forms, the presenting jury of the Assize of Clarendon, the petty jury that determined guilt or innocence in criminal cases, the grand jury that answered the question of right in civil land disputes, was an instrument for determining facts by the collective judgment of men who knew the local community and its affairs, rather than by the supernatural mechanisms of ordeal and battle that had previously served as the primary modes of proof. This shift from supernatural to human evidence gathering was not, perhaps, fully articulated as a philosophical principle by those who implemented it, but its implications were enormous. It represented a move toward the idea that truth about human affairs is accessible through human investigation, through the examination of witnesses and the weighing of evidence, rather than through divine revelation mediated by fire or water or combat. The abolition of trial by ordeal followed from the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, which prohibited clerical participation in the ordeal, effectively ending a practice that required priestly blessing to be valid. But the infrastructure for replacing the ordeal, the jury system, that could serve as an alternative mode of proof was already in place, developed under Henry and extended under his successors, waiting for the moment when the ordeal's religious foundation was removed. The coincidence of these two developments, the development of the jury under Henry and the abolition of the ordeal by the Lateran Council, is one of the more remarkable examples in legal history of institutional development, anticipating the need that would eventually make it indispensable. The development of the common law had consequences for the relative power of different groups within English society that were not necessarily intended by those who created the system, but that followed, with a certain inevitability, from its logic. The extension of royal justice to the free tenants of England, the availability of the possessory assizes, the writs that gave ordinary landholders access to the king's courts, strengthened the position of those tenants relative to their lords, because it provided them with an alternative source of justice, a higher court to which they could appeal over their lord's head. This strengthening of the free tenant against the lord was not, in the short term, a democratic development in any meaningful sense. The free tenants who benefited from Henry's writs were not the bottom of English society. They were the middling ranks, the knights and franklins who held land by military or other free tenures, but in the longer term, it contributed to the development of a legal culture in which the king's law was, in principle, available to all, and in which the distinction between those who had access to royal justice and those who did not was, at least in theory, a distinction of legal status rather than of wealth and political connection. The Magna Carta of 1215, the document that is often cited as the foundation of English constitutionalism, the first great check on arbitrary royal power, was in many respects a product of the legal culture that Henry had created. The barons who forced King John to seal Magna Carta were using the legal concepts and procedures that Henry had developed. They were asserting, against a king they regarded as tyrannical, the principle that royal power was limited by law, by the customs of the realm, by the rights of free men established through the operation of the royal courts. The phrase from Magna Carta that has most reverberated through subsequent history, that no free man shall be imprisoned, or dispossessed, or outlawed, or exiled, or in any way harmed, except by the lawful judgment of his peers, or by the law of the land, draws directly on the legal culture of Henry's reign, On the notion that royal power operates through the law and is bounded by it, the Exchequer and its pipe rolls represent, in the documentary record of Henry's reign, something of extraordinary historical value. The closest approach to a systematic statistical picture of medieval English governance that survives from any period before the late Middle Ages. The pipe rolls annual records of the accounts rendered by the sheriffs of England at the twice-yearly sessions of the Exchequer survive almost continuously from the second year of Henry's reign, with 1 or 2 gaps, to the end of the medieval period and beyond, and they constitute, in their long sequence, one of the most remarkable documentary archives of any medieval government. They record, year by year, the revenues collected by each sheriff, the expenses authorized in the king's name, the debts owed to the crown, and the instalments in which those debts were being paid, the fines imposed by the royal courts, the proceeds of the forest law, the customs duties, the proceeds of particular royal estates, and dozens of other categories of financial transaction. Reading the pipe rolls of Henry's reign, which scholars have done, with increasing sophistication, since the 19th century reveals an administration of genuine complexity and genuine effectiveness. The sums recorded are large by the standards of the age. The categories are numerous and consistently applied. The mechanisms for audit the comparison of what a sheriff claimed to have spent with what the Exchequer accepted as legitimate expenditure are present and functioning. When a sheriff's account does not balance, when he has spent more than the Exchequer regards as authorized, the difference is carried forward as a debt on the next year's roll. When he has collected less than he should have, that too is noted and pursued. The system is not foolproof. Officials found ways to manipulate it, and the great inquest of the sheriffs in 1170 was itself evidence that the system could be corrupted. But it is systematic in a way that no comparable English financial administration before it had been, and its systematicity was Henry's achievement. The Dialogue of the Exchequer, the Dialogus de Scacario, written by Richard Fitz-Neal, the royal treasurer, in approximately 1177 or 1178, is the companion to the Glanville Treatise in the documentary record of Henry's governance. Where Glanville describes the legal system, the Dialogus describes the fiscal one. Fitz-Neal wrote it in the form of a dialogue between a master and a student, a pedagogical form appropriate to the kind of teaching that he apparently gave to those who were learning the craft of Exchequer administration, and it describes with remarkable clarity and precision the procedures by which the Exchequer worked, the twice-yearly sessions, the seating of the officials around the great checkered cloth from which the institution took its name, the method of calculation, by counters, placed in the cloth squares, the forms in which the sheriff's accounts were rendered and audited, the handling of disputed items, the recording of the final balance on the pipe roll, that the governance of England in the 1170s and 1180s had produced 2 major administrative treatises, accounts of the legal and fiscal systems, systematic, enough to be used as textbooks for those learning those systems, is itself a measure of how far Henry's institutional program had advanced. It implies a level of complexity, of regularization, of procedural standardization that requires documentation for its perpetuation, that can no longer be transmitted entirely through apprenticeship and oral instruction, but requires written guides to its operation. It implies, in short, a bureaucracy in something approaching the modern sense, an administration that operates according to established procedures that can be taught to new entrants, that continues to function regardless of who occupies any particular office within it. The mercenary soldiers that Henry employed throughout his reign are another dimension of his governance that deserves attention, because they represent a deliberate choice to supplement and, in some respects, to replace the feudal military obligation that had been the conventional basis of royal military power. The feudal host the army assembled from the military obligation of knights, who held their land from the king in exchange for specified periods of military service, was an instrument of limited flexibility. It could be called for the term of service agreed in the feudal contract, typically 40 days, after which it dispersed. For campaigns that required sustained commitment over longer periods, for garrisons that needed continuous occupation, for the kind of military pressure that could only be effective if it was maintained indefinitely, The feudal host was inadequate. Henry's solution was the mercenary, the professional soldier who served for pay rather than for land or feudal obligation, who could be retained as long as the money lasted, who could be dismissed when no longer needed, who had no stake in the political conflicts that complicated the loyalty of feudal vassals. The use of mercenaries was not new. Henry I had employed them, but Henry II used them on a scale and with a consistency that gave his military operations a professional character that the purely feudal armies of his predecessors had often lacked. The exchequer funded them from the revenues that the administrative system generated, and the combination of those revenues and that funding mechanism meant that Henry's military capacity was ultimately grounded in his fiscal efficiency, in the quality of his administration, in a way that was genuinely new in English royal governance. The Church of the 12th century was not a monolithic institution. It was a collection of competing jurisdictions, rival theological traditions, and contending administrative ambitions, bound together by the shared language of Latin, the shared currency of papal authority, and the shared narrative of the Christian faith, and Henry's relationship with it was correspondingly complex, extending far beyond the Becket affair into a range of issues that engaged the full range of his governance philosophy. The monasteries of England were a significant presence in the governance of the realm, not merely as religious institutions, but as economic and administrative ones. The great Benedictine abbeys Canterbury, Winchester, Ely, Peterborough, Bury Street, Edmonds, Westminster held vast estates, managed complex agricultural and commercial operations, provided hospitality and administrative services to the itinerant royal court, maintained schools and scriptoria that were centres of learning and record-keeping, and served, through the abbots who sat in the royal council, as counsellors to the king. Henry's relationship with the monasteries was generally functional. He used them, and they used him, though it was occasionally complicated by disputes over jurisdiction and property that followed the same general pattern. As the larger conflict between royal and ecclesiastical authority, the new religious orders of the 12th century, the Cistercians, the Premonstratensians, the Augustinian canons had been establishing themselves in England since the reign of Henry I, and they continued to found new houses throughout Henry II's reign. Henry was a patron of new religious foundations, though his patronage was somewhat less lavish than that of his predecessors, reflecting perhaps a more calculating approach to the expenditure of royal resources, or perhaps simply the competing demands of his administrative and military priorities. He founded the Carthusian House at Witham in Somerset in approximately 1179, a foundation that may have been motivated, in part, by the continuing shadow of Becket's murder, and he maintained respectful relations with the various orders whose expansion he facilitated. The parish church, the basic unit of Christian life, for the overwhelming majority of Henry's subjects, was a dimension of ecclesiastical governance that touched Henry's legal reforms in a particularly direct way. The question of who had the right to present a priest to a parish living the advowson was a property right that was frequently disputed between laymen, and Henry's legal reforms provided, through the writ of Darren presentment, a mechanism for determining that right in the royal courts. The displacement of such disputes from the ecclesiastical courts to the royal courts was among the most contentious provisions of the constitutions of Clarendon, and it was one of the areas where Henry and Becket were most directly in conflict, because control over the appointment of parish clergy was, from the Church's perspective, an ecclesiastical matter of the first importance, and from Henry's perspective, a property matter that fell squarely within the jurisdiction of the royal courts. The pilgrimage to Canterbury that developed with extraordinary rapidity after Becket's murder and canonization became, within Henry's own lifetime, one of the most significant religious phenomena in England, drawing pilgrims from throughout the country and from continental Europe, generating a substantial economic impact on the city of Canterbury and on the religious houses along the pilgrimage routes, and producing, over the following centuries, the vast collection of miracle stories and hagiographic literature that surrounded the cult of Thomas the Martyr. Henry was himself among the pilgrims, performing his penance in 1174, and the act of the king's submission to the saint he had killed was invested with a symbolic power that contemporaries found overwhelming in its implications. The king, who had sought to limit the independence of the church, was on his knees before the tomb of the archbishop he had murdered, acknowledging the church's power to forgive and to chastise, demonstrating in his own person the subordination of secular authority to sacred judgment. The contradiction between this act of submission and the administrative program that Henry continued to pursue in the years that followed it is apparent, and it was apparent to contemporaries. Henry's penance did not change his fundamental governance philosophy. He continued to assert royal claims against the church in specific disputes. He continued to use the legal machinery he had developed to extend royal jurisdiction into areas the church regarded as its own. But he did so with somewhat greater tactical caution after Becket, more willing to negotiate, less willing to press confrontations to the kind of crisis that the Becket affair had produced. The lesson he seems to have drawn from the affair was not that his fundamental position was wrong, but that the means by which it had been pursued were counterproductive, and that a more patient and indirect approach would achieve more of what he wanted, with less of the political cost that the direct approach had generated. The relationship between Henry and the papacy of Alexander III, who reigned from 1159 to 1181, one of the longer pontificates of the medieval period, was not simply the adversarial one that the Becket affair might suggest. Alexander was, throughout his pontificate, dealing with the schism created by the imperial anti-pope Victor IV and his successors, and his need for the political and military support of the kings of France and England gave him strong incentives to moderate his position in the disputes with Henry, to find settlements that preserved the essential interests of the church without pushing the English king toward the imperial camp. The result was a papacy that was consistently more accommodating to Henry than the logic of its own reforming tradition might have required, and a relationship between the English crown and Rome that was, for most of Henry's reign, functional if not warm. The question of Henry's place in the broader intellectual currents of the 12th century, what historians have called the 12th century Renaissance, that extraordinary flowering of learning and thought that transformed the culture of Western Europe in the 100 years between approximately 1050 and 1150, is one that requires careful handling, because it is easy either to overstate his personal contribution to that movement, or to understate the degree to which his governance both reflected and enabled it. The 12th century Renaissance was driven by the recovery of classical learning above all of Aristotle, whose works on logic, natural philosophy, ethics, and politics were being translated from Arabic and Greek into Latin throughout the 12th century, and were transforming the intellectual landscape of Western Europe, and by the development of new institutions for the organization and transmission of that learning. The cathedral schools that had been the primary centers of learning in the 11th century were giving way, in the later 12th century, to the earliest universities, proto-universities, concentrations of masters and students in particular cities, Paris, above all, that were developing, the institutional forms, the curriculum, the degree, the corporation of masters that would define the university for centuries. Henry's governance was connected to this intellectual movement in several ways. The legal reforms he introduced required, for their operation, a corps of trained lawyers and administrators who could deploy the sophisticated procedural and substantive concepts that the new royal courts demanded. This demand contributed to the development of legal education in England, to the emergence of a class of professional legal practitioners who formed, over the course of the 12th and 13th centuries, the distinctive English legal culture, common law trained, oral in its primary procedures, resistant to the reception of Roman law that occurred elsewhere in Europe, that would be one of the most consequential features of English civilization. The royal chancery, which produced the writs and charters and letters that the administrative system required, was itself a school of sorts, training the clerks who worked in it in the forms and procedures of royal administration, providing them with a practical education in governance that was, in its own way, as systematic as the theoretical education available in the cathedral schools and the early universities. Many of the most significant intellectual figures of the later 12th century, Gerald of Wales, Roger of Hoveden, Ralph de Diceto, were men who had some connection to royal service, who had been shaped by the culture of Angevin administration, while also participating in the broader intellectual movements of their age. Gerald of Wales, Giraldus Cambrensis, deserves particular attention because his life and work illuminate, from a distinctive angle, the world that Henry's governance had created. Gerald was a Marcher lord by birth, his father an Anglo-Norman knight, and his mother a Welsh princess, a product of the borderland between two cultures that the political geography of Henry's reign had made particularly dynamic. He served Henry as a royal clerk and accompanied the young Prince John to Ireland in 1185, writing accounts of both Wales and Ireland that remain among the most vivid and detailed ethnographic documents of the 12th century. His portrait of Henry, included in his account of the king's last years, is one of the most detailed and complex character sketches of any medieval ruler, combining genuine admiration for Henry's intelligence and energy with critical observation of his failures and his flaws, the work of a man who had known the king at close quarters and had thought hard about what he observed. The world that Henry's governance had created, the world of the pipe rolls and the heir, of the possessory assizes and the petty jury, of the mercenary captains and the forest courts, and the itinerant king chasing his own household across the face of his dominions, was a world that was, in certain fundamental respects, more modern than the world his grandfather had governed, more organized, more legalized, more systematically administered. And yet it was also, in other equally fundamental respects, intensely medieval, governed by personal loyalty and personal authority, structured by the bonds of feudalism and the obligations of the church, animated by the same religious concerns and the same aristocratic values that had shaped European civilization since the fall of Rome. Henry was not a modern man who had strayed into the 12th century. He was a man of the 12th century who had done more than almost anyone else to create the institutional preconditions for the world that would, centuries later, be called modern. The castles of Henry's reign, the great stone fortifications that he built or rebuilt or demolished or garrisoned according to the needs of his governance, are another dimension of his physical legacy, the most visible and durable of the material expressions of his power. The castle in the 12th century was not merely a military installation, but a political statement, an assertion of authority over a particular landscape, a residence for a lord and his household, an administrative centre for the governance of the surrounding territory, and a prison for those whom the lord wished to confine. Henry used castles in all of these capacities, and his building programme, extensive though it was, is as revealing for what he demolished as for what he constructed. The demolition of unlicensed castles built during the Anarchy was, as has been noted, one of his earliest priorities. These castles, built by barons who had used the chaos of the Civil War to extend their local power, were the physical embodiment of the fragmentation of royal authority that Henry was determined to reverse. Their demolition was a political act as much as a military one, a demonstration that the king intended to be the ultimate authority over the landscape of England, that the permission to build and maintain a castle was a royal grant, not a right of any subject, however powerful. The resistance to demolition was, inevitably, considerable in some cases, and the process took years rather than months. But by the middle of Henry's reign, the principle was established, and the landscape had been significantly altered. The castles he built or substantially rebuilt at Windsor, at Winchester, at Orford in Suffolk, at Scarborough in Yorkshire, at Bridgnorth, at Chinon, and Montrichard in France, reflect the strategic priorities of his governance, the protection of key routes and harbour approaches, the domination of specific regions where royal authority was under challenge, the provision of comfortable and impressive accommodation for a court that was in constant motion. Orford is particularly interesting from an architectural perspective because its polygonal keep, one of the earliest in England, represents a significant advance in castle design, providing lines of fire that the earlier rectangular keeps could not achieve, and creating a structure of genuinely imposing elegance that served the king's purposes of display as well as his purposes of defence. The administrative geography of England. As Henry reorganised it, the division of the country into sheriffdoms, each administered by a royal sheriff accountable to the exchequer, each subject to visitation by the itinerant justices, each connected to the royal financial and legal system by the standardised procedures that Henry's reforms had established, was a geography of governance, in a sense that the pre-conquest and early post-conquest organisation of England had not been. The county had existed before Henry as a unit of administration, but it had been administered with varying degrees of royal oversight and through mechanisms that were less standardised, less systematic, and less directly connected to the royal will. Under Henry, the county became a unit of a genuinely national administrative system, one of 40 or so comparable units, whose relationship to the crown was defined by the same legal and fiscal procedures. The sheriff who administered this county was not a powerful regional magnate of the kind that had characterized the earlier period, a man who owed his position to his own lands and following in the region, and who used the shrievalty to extend his own power as much as to serve the crown. After the great inquest of the sheriffs in 1170, which had identified and removed many of the entrenched local magnates who had been using their sheriffdoms for private advantage, the sheriffs of Henry's later reign were increasingly men of a different kind, royal servants trained in the administrative culture of the court and the exchequer, dependent for their position on royal favour rather than on their own territorial base, and correspondingly more responsive to royal direction. This professionalisation of the shrievalty was a gradual process, not completed in Henry's reign, but it was substantially advanced, and it represented another step in the development of the distinctive English tradition of professional royal administration. The hundred, the subdivision of the county that served as the unit for certain administrative purposes, including the presentment juries of the Assize of Clarendon, was also reorganised and regularised under Henry, its boundaries clarified, and its administrative functions more precisely defined. The village, the basic unit of agricultural and social organisation for most of the population, was connected to this administrative hierarchy through its obligation to present men to the 100 juries and through its obligation to maintain the hue and cry, the community pursuit of criminals. That was one of the mechanisms by which the Assize of Clarendon was intended to operate. Henry's administrative reforms were not confined to the great institutions of the Exchequer and the royal courts. They reached down, through the county and the hundred, to the level of the village community, imposing standardized obligations and standardized procedures on a population that had previously been governed, in much of its daily life, by purely local custom. The question of what Henry's subjects thought of his governance, how the people who lived under it experienced it, what they valued in it, and what they resented, how the administrative revolution he accomplished was received by those in whose lives it intervened, is one that the surviving sources make difficult to answer with precision, because those sources were produced by a literate minority, the monks who kept chronicles, the royal clerks who produced the administrative records, the lawyers who were developing the forms of legal pleading, whose perspectives were not necessarily representative of those of the free peasants, the small knights, the townspeople, and the artisans whose lives Henry's governance touched most directly. What the chronicle sources suggest is a complex and ambivalent reception. The restoration of order after the Anarchy was genuinely welcomed. The chronicler Roger of Hoveden, writing in the later years of Henry's reign, reflects a view that was probably widespread among the literate class, that Henry had restored to England the good governance it had enjoyed under his grandfather, that the roads were safe again, that commerce could proceed, that the rule of law had replaced the rule of force. This is not merely royal propaganda. The contrast between the Anarchy and the governance that followed it was real enough to be felt by those who had lived through both, and the memory of the Anarchy, preserved in chronicles and in the consciousness of those old enough to remember it, gave Henry's restoration of order an emotional resonance that might not have attached to it had the pre-existing baseline been different. But the expansion of royal power, the extension of royal courts into areas previously governed by baronial or ecclesiastical jurisdiction, the imposition of forest law over a third of England, the increasing systematization of financial obligation to the crown was experienced by many as a burden rather than a benefit. The forest law, in particular, was a source of resentment that is visible in the sources across the entire period, from the conquest to Magna Carta and beyond. The restrictions on hunting, on clearing land, on the use of wood, that the forest law imposed on those who lived within the forest boundaries were constraints on activities that those people regarded as natural and necessary, and the fines imposed for forest offences were a significant financial pressure on communities that operated on narrow margins. The expansion of royal financial exaction, more broadly, the increased scrutiny of sheriffs' accounts, the imposition of the Saladin tithe, the forest fines, the judicial amercements that accumulated in the pipe rolls represented, from the perspective of those who paid them, a government that was becoming progressively more expensive to live under. The barons who would force King John to seal Magna Carta were responding, in part, to a fiscal pressure that had been building since Henry's reign, as the royal administrative system became more sophisticated and more demanding of the resources of the realm. The grievances of Magna Carta are, in their deepest roots, grievances about the consequences of Henry's governance, amplified by John's particular incapacity for political management, but rooted in the structural changes that Henry had introduced. The towns of England, the borough communities that were developing throughout the 12th century, as centres of commerce and craft production, had a particular relationship to Henry's governance that was shaped by the charters he granted them and by the legal protection that the royal courts provided to their members. Henry granted borough charters to a number of English towns, confirming or extending the liberties and privileges that gave townspeople some degree of self-governance and some protection from the arbitrary demands of local lords. The merchants who traded in those towns, the artisans who produced the goods that trade required, the money changers, and the financiers whose services both commerce and royal government needed, were among the primary beneficiaries of the stability and the legal regularization that Henry's governance produced, and their prosperity contributed to the tax revenues that funded the administrative system from which they benefited. The Jews of England, a community that occupied a peculiar and precarious position in medieval English society, protected by royal authority, but subject to specific legal disabilities and exposed to periodic outbreaks of popular violence, were deeply connected to the royal financial system of Henry's reign. Jewish moneylenders provided a significant portion of the credit that English commerce and English magnates required, and the Exchequer developed, under Henry, specific mechanisms for recording and managing Jewish debts, the arcae, or chests, in which records of Jewish financial transactions were kept that gave the Crown both an oversight role in Jewish financial activity and a claim on the assets of Jewish creditors in certain circumstances. Henry's protection of the Jews was not humanitarian in motivation, it was fiscal, reflecting the Crown's interest in the financial services that the Jewish community provided. But it was real, and it gave the Jewish community in England a stability it did not always enjoy elsewhere in Europe during this period. The physical world that Henry moved through, the landscape of England and France, and the wider world that his governance sought to organize, was a world that looked, in its fundamental natural features, much as it would look today, but that was organized, in its human dimensions, around principles so different from those of the present that the distance between his world and ours is, in certain respects, greater than the 8.5 centuries of calendar time would suggest. England in the 12th century was more forested, less drained, with large areas of marsh and wetland that are now agricultural land, with fewer and smaller roads, with a population perhaps a quarter of what it would be at the time of Domesday Book in 1086, itself a relatively small population by modern standards that had recovered somewhat from the disruptions of the power, conquest, and was growing slowly through the expansion of cultivation. The agricultural landscape was organized around the open field system in most of lowland England, in which the arable land of a village was divided into strips distributed among the villagers, with common pasture for livestock and common meadow for hay. The seasonal rhythms of agricultural production, ploughing and sowing, tending and harvesting, structured the lives of the overwhelming majority of Henry's subjects in ways that the king's administrative reforms touched only tangentially. The towns were small by any modern standard. London, the largest, probably had a population of no more than 20 or 30,000, but they were growing, stimulated by the expansion of trade, by the development of market networks, by the increasing specialization of production that commerce made possible. The great fairs, Stourbridge, Street, Ives, Boston, Winchester, were annual events of considerable commercial significance, drawing merchants from England and from the continent, providing a mechanism for the redistribution of goods and the settlement of debts on a scale that no individual market could achieve. The development of these commercial networks and the legal and administrative infrastructure that Henry's governance provided for them was one of the factors driving the economic growth that characterized the later 12th and early 13th centuries. The church buildings of Henry's England, the great cathedrals and abbey churches that were being built or rebuilt throughout his reign in the new Gothic style that had developed in northern France in the 1130s and 1140s, were the most visible and imposing physical monuments of the age, the material expression of the religious values that animated medieval civilization. The choir of Canterbury Cathedral, burned in 1174 and rebuilt in the years that followed in a magnificent Gothic style under the master mason William of Sens, was one of the most important architectural achievements of Henry's reign, though it was a product of the church's wealth and ambition rather than of royal patronage. The cathedrals of England were, in a sense, the administrative counterparts of the royal pipe rolls. Both were products of sophisticated, literate, professionally trained institutions. Both were monuments to the organizational capacity of the 12th century, and both would survive, in various conditions and with various modifications, long after the human beings who produced them had been forgotten. Henry himself, in his physical person, inhabited this world with an intensity that seems, from the surviving accounts, almost excessive, a man who lived at the maximum speed and the maximum engagement with the world around him that the human constitution permitted. He is described by contemporaries as a man who was never still, who paced during councils, who stood when he could, who was impatient of ceremony, who preferred the directness of action to the formality of ritual. The contrast with the ceremonial kingship of the Byzantine tradition, or even with the more elaborate court ritual of some of his continental contemporaries, is striking. Henry's kingship was a working kingship, a kingship of constant movement and constant decision-making, in which the formal aspects of royal dignity were present, but were never allowed to impede the actual business of governance. His table was, by the accounts of those who ate at it, irregular and informal, the food adequate but not lavish, consumed hastily, and in the midst of business, rather than in the elaborate ceremonial feasts that other courts maintained. His dress was relatively simple, practical rather than magnificent. He wore, famously, a short cloak that was unusual enough to earn him from contemporaries the nickname Kurtmantle, short cloak. The informality was not indifference to the projection of royal power. Henry understood perfectly well the importance of the symbolic dimensions of kingship, but a particular version of it, one that communicated power through action and decision, and the evident command of information and process, rather than through display and ceremony. The assessment of Henry II, the effort to arrive at a balanced understanding of his place in the history of England and of European governance more broadly, is one that requires holding in mind, simultaneously, the genuine magnitude of his achievements and the genuine seriousness of his failures, without allowing either the achievements to excuse the failures or the failures to diminish the achievements. The case for Henry as the most consequential English king of the medieval period, a claim that not all historians would accept, but that has distinguished and serious advocates, rests on the durability and significance of his institutional legacy. The common law of England, which he founded, was not merely a collection of procedural rules, but a fundamental shaping force in the development of English civilization, one of the principal mechanisms by which English society became organized around the concept of law as a constraint on power, rather than merely an instrument of it. The jury, which he introduced in systematic form, became one of the defining institutions of the English and later the Anglo-American legal tradition, the mechanism by which the determination of fact in legal proceedings was assigned to laypersons rather than to professionals, a feature of the common law with implications for democracy and self-governance that extended far beyond the specific legal questions it was originally designed to resolve. The fiscal administration he developed The cente, exchequer, the pipe rolls, the systematic auditing of royal revenue provided the financial foundation without which the military and diplomatic operations of the Angevin dynasty would have been impossible, and it established a tradition of royal financial administration that would develop, over the following centuries, into the sophisticated treasury operations of later English governance. The office of the justiciar, the heir, the system of sheriffs, accountable to the crown through the exchequer and subject to oversight by itinerant justices. These were the organizational infrastructure of English royal governance for the remainder of the medieval period. The case for Henry is something darker, the dangerous king of the title, the man whose power was exercised without adequate restraint, whose governance imposed burdens that his subjects experienced as oppressive, whose personal failings had political consequences of the first magnitude, is equally serious and equally founded in the historical record. The Becket affair was not merely an unfortunate accident. It was the product of a governance philosophy that prioritized royal power over institutional independence in a way that, whatever its rational foundation, led to a catastrophic outcome. The treatment of Eleanor, the 16 years of captivity, was an act of political management that treated the woman who had brought him Aquitaine and borne him 8 children as a political problem to be contained rather than a person with rights and dignity. The treatment of his sons, the refusal to give them real power, the repeated manipulation of their inheritances, the favoritism toward John that drove Richard into alliance with Philip, was a failure of governance as well as of parenthood, a failure that ultimately destroyed him. He was dangerous in the way that all great concentrations of power are dangerous. The same capabilities that enabled his achievements made possible his most serious abuses. The administrative system that gave ordinary English free tenants access to royal justice also gave the crown a mechanism for extracting revenue with unprecedented efficiency, and the experience of that extraction was not uniformly benign. The legal system that replaced the arbitrary violence of baronial courts with the procedures of royal justice also used those procedures to advance royal interests at the expense of clerical and baronial independence in ways that were not always legitimate. Power, when it becomes sufficiently concentrated and sufficiently sophisticated, has effects that its wielder does not always intend and cannot always control, and Henry's power was both concentrated and sophisticated to an unusual degree. The category of dangerous is itself worth interrogating, because it implies a relationship between power and threat, and the question of who was threatened by Henry's power has more than one answer. To the baronial class, he was dangerous because he systematically curtailed the local power they had accumulated during the Anarchy. To the church, he was dangerous because he challenged jurisdictional claims that the reforming papacy regarded as essential to ecclesiastical independence. To his own family, he was dangerous because the concentration of power in his person left his sons no room to develop their own governance capacities. To the ordinary free tenants of England, he was, paradoxically, both dangerous and protective. Dangerous as a source of fiscal extraction, protective as a guarantor of justice against the arbitrary power of their immediate lords. The judgment of dangerousness depends, in the end, on who is making it and from what position. What remains, after all the assessment and reassessment, is a figure of undeniable historical magnitude. A man who inherited a kingdom in ruins and built on its foundations institutions that would endure for centuries, who governed with an energy and a comprehensiveness that astonished his contemporaries, who failed in the things that were most personal to him, his marriage, his relationship with his sons, his friendship with Becket while succeeding, with a thoroughness that approached genius in the things that were most public and most institutional about his role. He was, in the fullest and most ambiguous sense of the term, a great king. The legacy of Henry II is not a simple thing to hold in the mind, because it is distributed across so many different domains: legal, fiscal, military, cultural, dynastic, and because the different dimensions of that legacy point in different directions, some toward the development of liberty and the rule of law, others toward the concentration of power and the diminishment of alternative jurisdictions. To follow the legacy fully is to follow the entire subsequent history of England, because the institutions he created were so fundamental to the subsequent development of English governance that almost nothing of consequence in that development was independent of what he had built. The Plantagenet dynasty that he founded, though he did not use that term, which is a retrospective designation, endured, in various forms, for more than 3 centuries, from his accession in 1154 to the death of Richard III at Bosworth Field in 1485. The men who followed him on the throne of England, Richard I, John, Henry III, Edward I, Edward III, Richard II, Henry IV, Henry V, Henry VI, Edward IV, Edward V, Richard III were all his descendants, all inheritors of the institutional framework he had created, all working within a governance tradition that bore his stamp as decisively as it bore that of any single individual. Richard I Coeur de Lion. The Lionheart was in many ways the most complete contrast to his father that could be imagined. A soldier of legendary reputation, who regarded England primarily as a source of revenue for his crusading activities, who spent less than a year of his 10-year reign in his kingdom, and who nevertheless left England better governed at his death than he had found it, largely because the institutional inheritance from his father was sufficiently robust to function in his absence under the management of justiciars of the quality of Hubert Walter. The institutional infrastructure Henry had built did not require the king's continuous presence to function. That was precisely its greatest virtue and its most consequential legacy. John, Henry's youngest and in many ways most tragic child, demonstrated both the robustness and the limits of that legacy. John was an intelligent man, more intelligent than his reputation, which has been shaped too decisively by the combination of hostile chroniclers and the propaganda needs of the rebel barons who forced Magna Carta upon him who had absorbed, from growing up in his father's court, a genuine understanding of the administrative system and a genuine ability to use it. But he lacked his father's capacity to manage the human dimensions of governance, the networks of loyalty, the distributions of favour. The management of great men's pride and his failures in that domain, combined with the loss of Normandy in 1204, created the political crisis that produced Magna Carta. Magna Carta, issued in 1215, is the document in which Henry's legal legacy most fully intersected with its political consequences. The barons who forced it on John were using the legal culture Henry had created, the concept that royal power was bounded by law, the language of the free man's rights, the procedures of the royal courts to constrain a king who had, in their view, abused those concepts and violated those rights. The document they produced drew on the legal tradition Henry had founded while reacting against the governance methods that tradition had made possible. It was, in a profound sense, Henry's legacy arguing with itself. The common law that Henry founded continued to develop for centuries after his death, accumulating case by case, precedent by precedent, into the vast and intricate structure that would eventually spread through English colonialism and the development of the British Empire to become the legal foundation of the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, and dozens of other countries. The jury, his jury, became the cornerstone of legal proceedings in all of these jurisdictions. The principle that royal or governmental power is bounded by law, a principle that his governance did more than any other to establish, in English practice, became one of the foundational ideas of constitutional governance in the modern world. It is worth pausing, at the end of any account of Henry II's reign, to consider what he himself would have made of this legacy had he been able to foresee it. He was not a man who thought in terms of centuries, or who would have conceived of his administrative innovations as contributions to a tradition of constitutional liberty. He was a man who thought in terms of practical problems and practical solutions. The problem of the anarchy required the restoration of royal authority. The restoration of royal authority required reliable fiscal machinery and reliable legal procedures. Those procedures, once established, required protection from the competing jurisdictions of the barons and the church. The framework of constitutional liberty that subsequent generations would build on his foundations was not his intention, but his consequence. And the gap between intention and consequence is one of the most revealing features of his historical significance. He lies at Fontevraud in Anjou, in the great abbey church that became the necropolis of the Angevin dynasty. His effigy, carved in the years following his death, shows him in the pose of a sleeping king, crowned, sceptered, his face bearing that expression of composed authority that medieval funerary art assigned to the royal dead, regardless of the circumstances of their dying. Beside him lies Eleanor, who outlived him by 15 years and who died at Fontevraud in 1204, having seen the loss of Normandy and the unravelling of much that he had built. Beside her lies Richard, who died at Chalus-Chabrol in 1199 from a crossbow bolt, his legendary military career ending with an inglorious wound in a minor siege in Limousin, and nearby, in a separate tomb, lies their daughter Joanna. They are together in death, as they were so often apart in life, reunited in the stone sleep of the medieval monument, their faces turned toward the vaulted ceiling of Fontevraud, as if listening, still, for something that has not yet been said. The man who built more than almost any other king of his century, who remade the legal and fiscal landscape of England with an energy and a comprehensiveness that his contemporaries found astonishing and that posterity has found, with equal consistency, remarkable. That man died broken, abandoned by his favourite son, defeated by his eldest son, humiliated by the King of France, his birthplace in flames behind him as he rode north toward a death that he perhaps welcomed as the only available release from the failure that had overtaken him. The dangerousness of Henry II lay not only in the power he wielded over others, but in the power that circumstance and his own character ultimately wielded over him. The power to reduce the greatest builder of his age to a man turning his face to the wall, releasing everything he had spent his life constructing into the uncertain hands of the future, which would use it, misuse it, build upon it, and argue about it, for as long as there were people who cared about the history of how the present came to be what it is. That future began on the 7th of July in 1189, the day after Henry died at Chinon, and it has not ended yet. The historians who have written about Henry II, and they are numerous, from the Victorian scholars who first subjected the pipe rolls to systematic analysis, to the 20th century legal historians who trace the origins of the common law to his innovations, to the contemporary biographers who have attempted the full synthesis of a life and reign of daunting complexity, have returned, again and again, to the same paradox, that a man whose personal relationships were so comprehensively destructive could have built institutional structures of such enduring constructiveness. The paradox is real, but it is not, perhaps, quite as paradoxical as it appears, because the same quality, the refusal to allow any person or any institution to operate outside the framework of his authority that made him a domineering and ultimately destructive husband and father, also made him a builder of institutions whose whole point was the concentration and systematization of authority. He could not share power with Eleanor, with young Henry, with Becket, because sharing power was, to him, a kind of self-dissolution. He could share power with institutions, with the exchequer, with the heir, with the jury, because institutions were extensions of his will, instruments of his authority, not rivals to it. The distinction between person and institution, between rival and instrument, was the governing distinction of his governance, and it was also, in a tragic way, the governing distinction of his life. He was the most dangerous king in Plantagenet England, not because he was cruel, though he could be, not because he was arbitrary, though he sometimes was, but because he was capable, with a consistency and a comprehensiveness that no English king before him had achieved, of bringing the full force of organized royal power to bear on every domain of English life that he chose to engage with. That capacity, that organized, systematic, relentless dangerousness is his most permanent characteristic and his most permanent legacy.